There was a time when, in the world of childhood surprises, a new game appeared. It had absolutely everything that gamers could dream of. It was possible to immerse yourself in romance and adventure, engage in battles against bosses and terrifying monsters, and also use all sorts of delicious content. But all these advantages were leveled out by just one single fact: the character's short lifespan. So, over time, interest in the game waned and only die-hard fans remained. And in this case, we will talk about one of them, the worst expert in this game. In the future, he will have to test his strength. But to be fair, it would be worth first going back to the time when the game was at the peak of its power. Many years ago, as soon as the game was released, our hero immediately fell in love with it. The gaming experience was so captivating that the naive boy subsequently became completely immersed in the game. One day, a familiar voice called out to Nate. The protagonist immediately realized that the person who was addressing him was a boring moneylender. But no matter what he said, Nate could no longer be stopped. Confidently, Nate opened the gates before him. Standing before the majestic sword, he hoped to see and find hope. As he stood, Nate kept running through his thoughts the details of his gaming accomplishments over the past 15 years. Initially, the hero was amazed by the product, not even suspecting how much time he spent in it. But now, Nate saw the perfect moment to pay off his debts through gambling. Using the enhancement crystal, he extended his hand. Immediately, the system notified him about the creation of an executive sword. The process of subsequent weapon buffs began immediately. Licking his lips, Nate was ready to continue. One more try and luck smiled on Nate again, upgrading the sword's characteristics. Time and again, chance worked on Nate's side. From such frequent luck, Nate's self-esteem rose, and his passion was inflamed. For the sake of another successful attempt, he decided to pray to all possible gods. Plucking up his courage, Nate took another crystal out of his inventory. The action was completed, and something inside the sword suspended in the air flashed. Nate let out a triumphant cry as he managed to use the enhancement once again. Licking his lips, he believed that on this day, everything he had planned would come true. Now, without a break, he raised the crystal again. He yelled something unintelligible and used it. Another, but even brighter flash came from the hovering sword. The boost happened again, causing Nate to let out a victorious roar. Nate, oozing madness, believed that today was his happiest day. But then he remembered that the part with the moneylender was still open. Nate smiled slyly, believing that the debt story had finally come to an end. Nate even shed a tear, predicting a new beginning. But in the end, he pulled himself together and restrained himself. After all, now thanks to the weapons obtained from loans, and also greatly strengthened, Nate expected to get rich. It was then that an unusual idea came to Nate's mind regarding the optionality of selling the sword. After all, if Nate lost that, he would no longer be able to earn money. In fact, at 35 years old, this sword was the only achievement in Nate's life. Breaking out of his thoughts, he slowly turned his gaze back to the sword. Then, an idea was born in his head to try to strengthen the sword again, achieving an 8-fold improvement. In any case, Nate had nothing to lose. After all, the protagonist's life was miserable, full of despair and fear. And now, if Lady Luck smiles on Nate again, he might even be able to buy his own apartment. Ignoring the moneylender's yapping, Nate decided to take on one more test. The action was carried out, and from the depths of the sword a growing hum began to be heard. It was followed by an expanding flash of light. Upon completion, a notification from the system followed, delighting Nate with the implementation of another enhancement of the sword. Tears streamed from Nate's eyes, and he thanked the gods for his success. Nate laughed, because this day really was a happy one. But gradually his laughter died down. The gaze touched the sword again. Another crazy thought pushed Nate to take a risk. Sighing, Nate shook his head in understanding. After which, the hero was ready to use the crystal again. If he was successful now, Nate knew he could now afford to buy an entire penthouse. He had already seen men wanting to be his friends, and women jumping into his bed in droves. An absolutely luxurious life, for a 10-fold increase in the sword's characteristics. These fantasies gave Nate unprecedented strength. After all, he couldn't miss out on taking advantage of something like this on his lucky day. The action was carried out, and the joy instantly disappeared from Nate's face. A high chance of error occurred and the sword was destroyed. Nate stood dumbfounded, not really expressing any emotions. At some point, Nate's hand began to shake nervously. Gradually, despondency began to overwhelm him, because the happy day had not lived up to its promise. Immediately, the loan shark got in touch and reminded him that Nate had to go somewhere. Thousands of ideas about his own demise and reprisals from the moneylender hit Nate's head. Now crying, he dreamed of returning to the past, so as not to start this game. At some point, he felt as if his head was spinning. Nate swayed, trying to stay on his feet, but in the end, unable to control his body, he went into free flight. Darkness surrounded him, which then grew into a wave of light, in which Nate was rushing somewhere. Subsequently, with a deep breath, the hero woke up in bed. Frightened, his eyes began to examine the room. The first thing Nate noticed was the IV. Next, a tag attached to your bed. Nate had no idea where he was or why he was there. Around the same time, someone was glad about the hero's awakening. The short doctor admitted that he was worried about Nate. The protagonist asked him again, not understanding. The doctor explained that Nate was experimenting with the Viera capsule and had a seizure. But all these words and events were something wild for Nate. The man behind the doctor spoke up, apologizing to Nate and already handing over compensation from the capsule's developer. Feeling a strange sense of déjà vu, Nate glanced at the wall clock. A minute later, Nate realized that he had spent not 15 years in the capsule, but only 15 minutes. But the premature joy disappeared from Nate's face. After all, he clearly remembered that he was a nerd rejected by society. This means that when everything returned to normal, Nate really did return to the past. As quickly as possible, he tried to remember all the bright moments of his life over the past 15 years. Still, some doubts tormented Nate. After leaving the hospital, he wandered home. There, overcome by thoughts, Nate lay down on the floor. Something was tormenting him, taking away all his possible strength. By chance, out of the corner of his eye, he glanced at his reflection in the glass. There, a young man's face, devoid of wrinkles, looked at itself. Standing up, he began to examine himself closely. At some point, a strange, awkward feeling touched Nate. For a second or two, he saw himself, exhausted, reflected in the future. He even began to imagine that a long gaming life was simply a nightmare. When she was younger, Nate's sister wanted to be a podcaster. But one day, the little sister was unlucky and was caught by an enemy guild. One very important item was captured by an unholy player. To somehow help his sister, Nate found the strongest monster and sold the item it dropped. And later, Nate even took out a loan. It just so happened that the only thing Nate knew how to do in his life was be a gamer. And now, after thousands of hardships, difficult decisions, and deprivations, Nate again looked at his younger self in the reflection. It seemed as if he had come to believe that his long life as a gamer was just a dream. Having calmed down, he exhaled with relaxation. But then he became angry, refusing to believe such a thing. What particularly bothered him was that in 15 years, the most successful game had simply gone down the drain. With this thought in mind, Nate headed into the next room. Having activated the capsule, he wanted to play one more time. As he climbed inside, he activated the immersion process. Flashes, color changes, and Nate found himself in a completely different world. The first thing he saw was a strange glowing line somewhere on the horizon. Heading towards her, Nate reached the tower. Everything here was familiar to Nate, and would likely have remained untouched for the past 15 years. Then, the protagonist decided to find out something. With a quick movement, he called up his inventory. In that, there was only one sword. There was no choice, so the hero took it in his hands. He moved on until he met his first opponent, an overgrown beetle. Nate smiled, clearly remembering that this was exactly the meeting that was supposed to happen. The beetle began to chirp and was ready to pounce on Nate. But the hero got ahead of the monster, rushing past, making a quick attack with his sword. Nate grinned, because destroying such creatures was as easy as pie. But then the chirping sound came again, and the beetle again aimed at Nate. Flying towards the hero, he stretched out his paws. Luckily, Nate dodged the jabs. After waiting for the right moment, Nate picked up speed and ran along the walls. Pushing off from them, he flew up to kill the beetle with one blow. Now, in flight, the protagonist remembered where the beetle's weak point was. As he got closer, instinctively, his hands aimed at the back of the monster's neck. The monster was pierced, but its wings were still fluttering. For a split second, Nate winced in sudden rage. With all his strength, he grabbed the monster by the wing. Then he pulled it towards himself, tearing it out by the roots. Having done this, Nate examined his body, admitting that it was extremely light and strong, in no way resembling a 30-year-old man. He even thought that he had grown younger not only himself, but also as a character in the game. Meanwhile, he again turned his attention to the already defeated beetle. For the sake of loot, Nate dug his hands into the carcass. A couple of seconds passed and then Nate felt something. Taking it out, Nate examined the poisonous sting, a new melee weapon. When he finished, Nate stood up, straightening up. Now, confident in his memory, the hero intended to do everything correctly. Nate was ready to right the wrongs of his past self, but also to have a good bit of fun. After all, knowing about all the delights of the game, all the hidden places, secret quests, and dissolute women, Nate was going to take all of this only for himself. But first, Nate had to pass the training tower in order to enter the main world of the game. With enough information for all 15 years, Nate had no trouble overcoming the tower's challenges. Besides, Nate remembered very well that the numbering of the floors also reflected the number of monsters hidden there. As the player climbs higher, he would encounter more and more enemies along the way. But all these difficulties were nothing to Nate. As if playing with the monsters one after another, Nate destroyed them. So Nate's climb to the top of the tower took some time. Here and there, everywhere, there were corpses of monsters lying around. Breathing heavily as he climbed the steps, the number 9 finally appeared before Nate's eyes. Trying to catch his breath, the hero stared at her. Suddenly, the system notified Nate that a new record for clearing had been set on the 9th floor. As it turned out, they were talking about Nate himself, who managed to destroy the enemies faster than anyone else. In response to a system request, the hero decided to have his name displayed in tables as expert. The system readily registered the username. Immediately after this, he offers Nate to choose the difficulty level for the boss on the 10th floor. Nate was surprised, because he had never heard anything like this before, since the game wasn't exactly famous for its hidden mechanics. Apparently, the privilege was only available to the top of the rankings, so the system was happy to let Nate choose the difficulty level. Based on the abbreviations, Nate understood that each difficulty level made the boss stronger than the previous one. Having finally made his choice, Nate hovered his finger over the dialogue box. Just one poke and Nate's upcoming boss was raised to the highest possible difficulty level. Nate was confident in his abilities, knowing that he could handle such a problem. Now, smiling, he climbed the spiral staircase. At the same time, among the players, someone named Expert was already being actively discussed. No one believed that a person of that level would be able to defeat a C-rank boss. However, such a successful newcomer raised many questions in the gaming community. At any cost, they decided to find out the identity of the expert. At the same time, at the very top of the tower, a demonic creature met Nate. The boss swung his halberd and slammed it onto the floor, causing a shockwave. Remembering the boss's attack pattern, the hero twisted and threw the poisonous blade he had found earlier at him. Now Nate went on the attack in order to finish off the boss. Just one well-aimed blow, and the Skeleton King crumbled before the hero. The protagonist laughed, because the victory had come incredibly easily to him. Afterwards, he began to approach the remains of the boss, getting closer and closer so that, like last time, I could get some loot from that one. The system rewarded Nate by giving him plate armor, although such a reward meant absolutely nothing to the protagonist. After all, such armor was worthless and unworthy of a true expert. Next, Nate planned to leave the tower and enjoy some tasty morsels. But first, the hero decided to check something in the tower itself. Here and there, Nate began to actively lean against the walls and the floor. The efforts paid off and soon the hidden symbol was discovered. Nate highlighted this knowledge in his past life while watching interviews with top players. The story turned out to be true, because by hurrying, Nate managed to open a path to a whole new 11th floor. Now, something truly new awaited the hero, something that Nate had never achieved. Nate stepped forward, throwing his leg over his head briskly. He had barely taken a few steps when something flew out towards Nate. Fortunately, the hero managed to escape death and simply collapsed to the floor. Then someone's powerful fist struck nearby. Nate dodged the damage to himself as best he could. Later, when he ran away, he could not even imagine that the boss would be so strong. And that's it. The boss's power finally caught up with Nate. Having lost his balance, the protagonist fell onto his back. His eyes flinched, because Nate was furious at the way everything was unfolding. Coming to his senses, he sat up, seeing the boss right in front of him. Immediately, the system displayed information describing the boss as a prison advisor. Nate tried to wake up because, judging by the text, the boss was not C, but S rank. Once again, the world had given Nate a slap in the face, and now the boss was about to carry it out. Bent over in three, the protagonist still managed to dodge the powerful fist. The boss's subsequent strike nearby sent Nate flying. The prison advisor, a hidden boss of the highest difficulty, became available to players 10 years after the game's launch. Players formed alliances, entire guilds perished, challenging the prison advisor. So now, the protagonist was practically screaming, asking how he could defeat the boss. Time after time, the prison counselor was nearby, causing Nate to be thrown up to the ceiling like an inflatable toy. During one of his flights, something interesting came to Nate's mind. He grouped himself and jumped away from the boss. Looking closely, Nate found something amiss in the situation. The boss also stopped, and a roar and the clicking of hundreds of teeth could be heard coming from his direction. Nate shook himself and straightened up. Then he smiled, because he finally understood something. Looking at the boss's bracelets, the hero guessed that they were what were holding back the big guy's speed. Nate also assumed the spikes on the prison counselor's back were the devices that restrained him. For Nate, this only meant that defeating the monster under these conditions should not be a problem. Believing that the boss was hiding some kind of Easter egg from the developers, the protagonist drew his sword. Nate began to move, intending to run around the boss. Finally reaching the vulnerable spot, the hero struck with his sword. The damage took place, but it reduced the boss's health to an absolutely ridiculous amount. The effect of what had been done did not impress Nate. But after that, a crazy smile came over him again. After all, despite the debuffs on his weapon, Nate managed to remove very little health from the boss. So, for now, he decided to focus on the boss's attacks, which were easy to dodge. Besides, Nate didn't have to worry about his weapon, since the training sword couldn't be broken. There was only one problem for Nate regeneration, which could not be used in this zone. From all this, it turned out that a long battle awaited the protagonist. This is how the battle to the death between the expert and the tower creature began. The boss himself didn't have regeneration, so the battle took Nate at least several days. But all this time, Nate remembered perfectly well that even one hit on himself would definitely kill the hero. So Nate relied on his speed and concentration. With his presence in the game at stake, Nate let out a battle cry and intended to fight desperately. The only factor that was definitely on the protagonist's side was time. Time passed, and from that very moment, about 3 months passed. The great boss of the tower finally lay on his back. The player standing nearby could barely stand on his feet, drowning in streams of sweat. Moving on strength, Nate summed up that the battle was phenomenal. As soon as I sat down, a window from the system appeared, where the rewards issued in connection with the victory over the boss were written out. Nate's level had risen quite a bit, and his stats had also increased, but all of this was just tinsel for the hero. After all, Nate was now holding the most valuable thing, the dropped loot, tightly in his hands. It was the legendary razor, the weapon of the god of mischief himself. Legendary weapons were top-rated and could only be found in rare instances. Nate chuckled, because even one swing of the razor was enough to instill fear in the enemy. Nate's joy was cut short when a new notification from the system appeared annoyingly. As it turned out, they intended to forcibly move him from the tower. Not wanting anything like that, Nate additionally decided to remain human. Neither demons nor dragons had control over Nate anymore. Because of this, all sorts of player privileges suffered. But Nate wasn't too sad about the diminishing enjoyment of farming. Soon, Nate was struck by lightning, teleporting him straight to the rookie village. The local players became tense when a newcomer arrived in the village in this manner. Nate's appearance was somehow frightening, and some people found it downright repulsive. As it turned out, the protagonist was completely naked, standing, immersed in thought. Finally, one of the players dared to tear Nate away from his thoughts. Players giggling at Nate's image wanted to know where the protagonist got the item he put up for auction. However, the hero did not understand what they were talking about. While the players continued to question him, Nate himself smelled a strange odor coming from his own body. The number of players grew. They sought answers to their questions in order to get rich themselves. Having given up, Nate honestly told that he had obtained the item from the newbie tower. But the players didn't believe Nate, already deciding how to kill him and rob him as quickly as possible. Afterwards, the players started talking about Nate's level. Hiding his true level, Nate nodded his head, as if he were still quite green. Furthermore, Nate decided to play a role and even share information about the armor's location with the players. The players were encouraged, believing that Nate was a normal guy who could be dealt with. Nate was willing to tell everything, but first, he asked everyone who wanted to go to a quiet place. The events moved to a corner of the village where no one had ever been. The players walked in and were already waiting for Nate to tell them a story, but the protagonist suddenly started talking about what kind of thoughts the players were harboring. Their faces changed when the protagonist realized the players' selfish motive. Drawing his sword, Nate was ready to punish the players who lived by attacking newcomers. Nate's arrogance did not please the players, and they began to openly threaten him. In response, a chuckle and a smile from the hero were heard. Having decided everything for himself, Nate was already ready to punish those. The players were also not averse to a bit of fighting, and were already going on the attack. Having dodged the first of the villain's absurd attack, Nate was already piercing with his razor. He just let out a puzzled yelp, and his health dropped to 0. The brother of the deceased was stunned with shock at what he saw. The protagonist himself did not stop, continuing the bloody massacre. Blood flowed in all directions, forming purple streams. Having recovered from the shock, the brother intended to finish off Nate personally. However, Nate was quicker and was already nearby. But first, I kicked the scoundrel. While the hero was enjoying himself, one of the survivors, with a squeal full of fear, tried to escape. Jumping from his place like a hare, Nate had no intention of letting anyone go. Taking advantage of the moment and covering himself with screams, the player crawled around the corner. As he sobbed, he was completely sure that Nate was just pretending to be a newbie. Gradually, with a terrifying grin, Nate turned his head towards him. With his hand outstretched, he held a razor, ready to teach the player how to treat others. His subsequent terrible screams were lost among the high walls of the remote village area. The deed was done, and now it was time for Nate to loot. Among various things, the hero sometimes found all sorts of useful gadgets. For example, mucus units, which in themselves were useless. Luckily for Nate, one of the defeated had a concentration of slime in his inventory. Immediately, a notification came from the system that Nate's lot at auction had been purchased. Having opened the corresponding menu, Nate decided to consider what kind of major could have bought the lot. Afterwards, his gaze froze. It turned out that the amount Nate had requested was exceeded by at least 2 times. At first, due to shock, the hero was unable to even utter a word. Thus, Nate was able to understand what business is and how it is run. Nate was already anticipating how rich he would get with this kind of trading. With the help of this topic, Nate was ready to change his life, which would be radically different from the past. With these thoughts, he left the village and climbed the nearest tall tree. Reaching the top, Nate looked into the distance. There, in the distance, he could see the location of the demon labyrinth. Every now and then, he would tap the tree trunk with his new boots, which were comfortable and gave buffs. Finally, the protagonist decided that the time had come to speak. Next, he jumped down from the top of the tree. At this point, the story took a digression, recounting how archers had previously been an unclaimed profession. But there was one player who succeeded in this class, and he himself gained the status of a legend. Recalling this story, Nate compared his movement speed to that of the legendary archer. Moving quickly, soon someone's figure appeared in front of Nate. It was the demon who noticed the hero's movement. Nate rejoiced, deciding to test his powers on the demon. This reaction to himself drove the demon into a state of slight agitation. However, having snatched up the razor, Nate was already aiming for the demon's weak spot. But he didn't have time to do anything, because from behind the back of one demon, a whole horde of others immediately appeared. Holding back his emotions, Nate acknowledged that there were far more opponents than the hero had hoped to encounter. He had no choice but to start throwing circular punches. Here and there, deep cuts reached the demons' bodies. Spinning like a top, Nate dodged attacks on himself, continuing to endlessly damage his enemies. At some point, finishing his combo. Now was a good time to escape, but Nate had other plans for how to end the fight. Among the crowds of enemies, his eyes caught sight of a huge door. With maximum effort, he jumped up to the door in one lunge, knocking it down. The trap was immediately triggered, releasing a giant blade from the cables down. It was only by a miracle that Nate, with his legs and even his body twisted, managed to avoid being cut in half. But as soon as the blade touched the floor, it pierced it, creating a new trap underneath it. In this hole, Nate saw an advantage for himself, believing that with the help of new paths, he would be able to escape from the labyrinth. Immediately, he descended into the hole that had been created. In the darkness of the tunnels there, something was approaching the hero with loud steps. Nate looked up at the monster that acted as the dungeon's boss. In an instant, a muscle-bound leg struck the spot where Nate was. The earth shook from the shockwave, and dense pieces of it flew upward. However, Nate was no longer in the affected area. Being on the other side, he studied the boss. Only thanks to the huge percentage of speed, due to not wearing armor, Nate could easily dodge any attacks on himself. Seeing that the little man was still alive, the Scarlet Demon became enraged. Taking advantage of the moment, Nate decided to make fun of the boss, who was supposedly bored in the dungeon. After this was said, shouts, roars, and squeaks were heard from the darkness of the depths of the dungeon. Other demons that had been relentlessly tracking Nate all this time came to light. Grinning and consumed by the desire to kill, the demons slowly crept towards Nate. The hero laughed, saying that the demons were too slow. A random second and the hero disappeared from the demon's sight. Suddenly, an unknown force began to strike them. One after another, the thugs fell down, exhausted. Those who tried to resist the unknown force were especially hard hit. Once finished, Nate could only enjoy the symphony of pain. As it turned out, with the pinpoint strike technique, Nate simply overwhelmed all the demons with debuffing effects. Gradually, each of the demons died in agony. Looking up, all that was left for Nate to do now was deal with the biggest of the demons. At some point, the Scarlet Demon began to inflate his hairy belly, further spewing out all-consuming flame in front of him. Only by a miracle, and thanks to his speed, Nate managed to hide behind a random cobblestone. But the boss did not stop, now preparing his crushing attack. Taking a step, the Scarlet Demon straightened his fingers in a special way. Nate was mesmerized, not knowing what to do. But, having deceived with a gesture, just like the first time, the boss tried to trample the protagonist. Just before the attack, like a spring, Nate jumped up, which allowed him to save himself. The entire immediate area beneath the hero was now being destroyed. In flight, Nate managed to choose a landing distance where his fashionable boots made a cracking sound. The situation was so dangerous that Nate even let out a frightened sigh. But the hero did not lose heart, deciding to find out who would surrender first. In response, the demon tilted his head towards the player. Raising his leg again, he intended to trample the hero. About 3 hours have passed since then, and the demon still turned out to be weaker than Nate. Nate proudly greeted the congratulations from the system, now expecting a corresponding reward. After which, he looked somewhere to the side. There was a forest there, towards which, for some reason, Nate nodded affirmatively. The choice was made and Nate set off for the Nightmare Forest. It was a creepy area, inhabited by various carnivorous beetles. A little later, using his speed to the maximum, Nate escaped from a huge water spider. The hero did not understand why the monster continued to chase him, because Nate considered himself worthless prey. The chase continued, and with every second, the restless spider became closer. Finally, the claw of that one almost nailed Nate. Dodging and jumping as he went, Nate successfully avoided attacks on himself. At some point, a bold idea came to Nate's head. Changing his pace, he allowed the vile monster to get even closer to him. Next, changing route, Nate ran in the other direction of the forest. It was there, deliberately running to the slope from which he began to slide. But even as he moved faster down the slope, Nate didn't feel safe. After all, the hungry creature followed him tirelessly. At some point, almost right next to the hero's ear, the chirping of a spider's mandibles was heard. Nate stopped and turned around quickly. The huge, vile creature was very close. But, because of the steepness of the slope, she couldn't stop as effectively as Nate did. As a result, while rolling at full speed, the water spider crashed into the rock at full speed. Nate chuckled, because what he had done was part of the plan. After the collision, the scaly cobra, disturbed, crawled out of its ambush. Sitting down on the nearest rock, Nate decided to see how the fight would end. Both monsters growled and hissed, ready to tear each other to shreds. However, such a scene, for such a seasoned player as Nate, was not something surprising. Still, he wouldn't mind witnessing both bosses die at once. Subsequently, a unique piece of armor was put up for auction. And also, a second later, for a tidy ransom sum, swords were also put on display. Just like the first time, the players were shocked. No one could even imagine where Nate could get such things from. There were even conflicts between them, as each offered more and more money for similar lots. From his home, Nate was actively observing this madness. Suddenly, the joy disappeared from his face, because once upon a time, the hero behaved the same way. For the first time, Nate felt like he was that top player who watched everyone else scramble for crumbs. For a while, Nate was immersed in self-reflection. Suddenly, he woke up because the phone rang. Nate's uncle and protagonist kept calling him, but he wasn't eager to talk to him. Still, Nate decided to answer. As soon as he answered the call, an angry voice came out of the receiver, accusing Nate of wasting precious time. Clearly worried, Nate tried to justify himself by saying he was constantly busy. Uncle didn't believe Nate, openly believing that all the hero did all his time was play on the computer. Nate didn't answer, because his uncle, for all his intolerability, was right. Meanwhile, the uncle was waiting for Nate's visit, because he believed that he should finally grow up. At some point, Nate could no longer listen to the screams from the phone, and also despised his uncle for stealing the inheritance. After hanging up the call, Nate let out a sigh of relief, and then he laughed out loud, because the hero already had plans for a new life. It was a long road to development that would eventually lead Nate to the top. Having thought about all this, the hero shook his head back. Having warmed up slightly, an expression of confidence was reflected on his face. Looking back at the capsule, Nate was sure there was nothing more to catch in the beginner locations. It is for this reason that, having plunged into the game again, the protagonist arrived in the desert location. It was a deserted area filled with ancient ruins. Scanning the area through binoculars, Nate was certain that this was where his search should take place. Moreover, in order to get into the dungeon alone, the hero used one trick. So, taking out his razor, Nate asked his riding mount for forgiveness, after which, with a sharp movement, he finished him off. The merciless desert swept away the traces of Nate's crime, actively absorbing the blood. Having gone further, the hero noted that now he was in place. Suddenly, from somewhere in the distant dunes, something was moving towards Nate, digging up the sand. At some point, greedily tearing, it caught up with the carcass of the mount. Nate was pleased to meet and welcomed them. The sandworm itself appeared, crunching its jaws. The hero was enchanted by its power. Shortly after, the worm opened its jaws, emitting a long hum. Nate took a couple of steps back, now considering the best course of action. Soon, it came to the thought that it was time to run. Nate knew that he wouldn't be able to catch the worm easily, and besides, the player's damage wouldn't harm it in any way. Meanwhile, the worm twisted its body towards the hero. After which, scooping up sand, he began to pursue Nate. As Nate continued to run, his eyes caught the hope of victory. He ran as fast as he could, straight towards the ruins. With each movement, the sight of the ancient pyramid came closer and closer. Without even trying to slow down, at one point Nate was running along it. A couple of seconds later, there was a crash and the crack of stone. Near the pyramid, a column of dust and sand rose up. When everything had calmed down, Nate carefully crawled to the place where the collision occurred. Looking closer, the protagonist's face was struck by a smile. The hero rejoiced, because thanks to the worm, the much-needed journey was completed. Needless to say, without delay, Nate moved down the tunnel. At the end of it, coming out into the hall of abandoned ruins. Looking around, he even discovered the place from which the sandworm appeared in the dungeon. Various sculptures with weapons were installed on the sides of the hall, and also one statue that was more beautiful than all the others. Nate burst out laughing and decided to hurry, expecting to meet the local boss as soon as possible. Moving forward, he suddenly saw a half-open gate. Nate tensed, thinking that there might be someone else in the dungeon. The hero listened, as if he could distinguish distant voices. Now, behind the gates, the players were talking to each other. Players showed themselves to Nate, discussing the hero and believing that he was the only survivor of the raid. Finally, they appeared before the protagonist in all their glory. At first, Nate was silent, oozing with fierce discontent. The muscles in his face tensed, and the name Udahi flashed through his mind. The redhead herself recognized Nate, now inviting him to join the raid. From memory, the hero began to recall this insidious woman. It was the same Udahi who, time after time, played on Nate's feelings, asking for favors. But even her failures, thanks to his cunning feminine charms, Nate forgave every time. Whispering passionately in his ear, she pushed the hero towards various questionable decisions. It was after one of these incidents that the protagonist became mired in debt. Nate came to his senses, because he was young again, in the past, which meant that all the bad things hadn't happened yet. The second player spoke up, wanting Nate's help since the two of them couldn't handle the boss. He honestly offered the protagonist to play the role of a human shield. Then Nate grinned slyly. Nodding, he agreed to become the third participant in the raid. Later, the player said that the last 2 times, he and the redhead died, but their words echoed in Nate's heart with pain, reminding him of the hardships the hero had to endure. So now Nate was hatching a plan for revenge, how to get rid of both of them. Making their way along the ruins, the team soon came out into a new hall. There was a throne there, on which sat an unknown creature, which, with the arrival of the players, began to greedily sniff the air. Slowly, the outlines of the undead emerged from the darkness. After which, raising his staff, the undead loudly slammed it on the floor. The players stood still and tensed up. After a short pause, the squad's knight commanded the attack. In response, another blow from the staff was heard. Ancient magic came into effect, forcing the player to stop. In a moment of confusion, Udahi tried to switch to close combat, since all the members of the squad were good at it. Only at the very last moment did they notice that Nate had strangely disappeared somewhere. The players were angered by the protagonist's behavior, but they couldn't do anything about it. Udahi gritted her teeth, because she was counting on Nate as bait and victim. At some point, the knight cried out in surprise. The mechanism responsible for opening the gate to the boss was broken. Udahi almost screamed, now realizing that she had fallen into a trap, her face twisted in anger at Nate, ultimately recognizing that there was no other choice to resolve the situation. Sighing, the knight agreed with the redhead. At the same time, the nameless queen rose from her throne. In a desire to defeat her, the knight stepped forward first, like a battering ram. But the undead did not wait for victory over itself, and already swung its staff. In response, the knight held out his shield in front of him. It was he who suffered the heavy blow of the nameless queen. Then, magic began to bubble everywhere, rumblings of energy, as if they were feeding the staff itself. The knight was motionless, preparing to repel the next attack on himself. She didn't keep us waiting long. Having survived for the second time, the undead now moved on to close contact. Staying on his feet with the last of his strength, right now the knight commanded the redhead to begin to act. Having snatched up the blades, the girl began to accelerate. Jumping up, Udahi began to deliver rapid blows to the boss. Some of them even managed to cause visible damage to the nameless queen. The concentration on the knight had dropped, and now he too could come out of defense. Drawing his sword, he deliberately struck the undead's staff. Rizopich reported that the boss had suffered heavy damage, and all that was left was to finish him off. The knight confirmed that he had understood the plan, and now slowly moved forward. Nate watched this battle from a secluded place. From the outside, it seemed that the players were close to victory, but the hero knew one trick of the boss. Around the same time, the nameless queen's eye began to flash a different color. Suddenly, the undead's behavior changed, and their attacks became incredibly faster. The knight was worried, because with such a frequency of attacks, it would be impossible to intercept all the damage. But just now, a charged slash was delivered across the boss's body. There was an explosion, followed by a bright flash. Being closest to the epicenter of the explosion, the shield in the knight's hands completely shattered. Udahi was still in action, attacking the boss with her daggers, but even she was eventually forced to retreat. After all, the boss's previously familiar style has completely changed. But what worried the red-headed one most was the speed of the nameless queen. Thinking about this, she already saw how the staff was rushing towards the girl. Then, a harsh ringing echo was heard and sparks flew in all directions. A moment later, Udahi dared to open her eyes. The first thing she saw was the boss's severed head. And right above that, Nate was present, his razor swing stopped. Looking at the hero, the redhead couldn't believe her eyes. Suddenly, she was overcome with either joy or anger at the return of the protagonist to the battle. The knight was also dissatisfied, openly considering Nate a coward, who had also lured others into a trap. The hero didn't care about words, and moreover, openly considered himself a hero savior. Such self-confidence seriously irritated Udahi. The potential skirmish was interrupted because the system informed the group about the presence of another female player. It turned out that this was a hidden quest, but the players considered such information to be nonsense. Before the players knew it, Nate was gone. The knight was thinking about a more important problem: the raid participants' levels hadn't increased, and the boss hadn't dropped any loot. At the same time, a strange feeling began to tear Udahi's body apart from the inside. The red-haired girl cried from pain, and her body underwent a metamorphosis. As it turned out, the still-living nameless queen wanted to get Udahi's young, luscious body for herself. Her endless voice, like a drilling machine, crashed into the girl's mind. All this continued until Udahi could no longer resist. Necrotic magic surrounded her and covered her face for a couple of seconds. When the curtain fell, the laughter of the nameless queen came from Udahi's lips. Taking the staff in her hands, Udahi proclaimed that everyone should fall on their knees before her. Of those present, the knight stared at her in bewilderment. Nate remembered that the female character's participation in the raid was mandatory. At the same time, the redhead herself would have found herself truly locked inside the prison of her body. The knight opened the system directory and learned that Udahi had become possessed. The knight had no idea that such wild mechanics could be present in the game. He could only hope that the other bosses didn't have something similar. The protagonist realized that his plan to defeat the boss and eliminate the competition had failed. A couple of seconds later, a fireball burst out of the staff and rushed towards the knight. To the laughter of the renewed queen, it was destroyed. In the prison of souls, Udahi could only watch, unable to intervene. At the same time, while undergoing a raid, the redhead noticed something strange. The raid never ended as long as Nate remained in it. The hero, fiddling with his fingers, squeezed the razor of fear more comfortably in his hand. Both versions of Udahi were unhappy with Nate's presence in the raid. The renewed nameless queen pointed her staff at the hero. The protagonist used his speed to dodge the destructive beam. He even chuckled, daring his boss to be more efficient. The undead were enraged by the naked boy's boasting. Pointing her staff at Nate, the queen fired a multitude of destructive beams. But such efforts from the boss were of no use to Nate. With each dodge, he drew closer to the nameless queen. The possessed woman let out a cry of displeasure and waved her staff. The hero easily dodged the attack by simply ducking. Seeing Nate between her legs, the nameless queen flared up with a vengeful rage. Having cast a spell, she destroyed everything that was near her feet. At the end, recreating the fiery wall of absorption. When all the effects wore off, Udahi was discouraged. Nate lay on the floor right in front of her, yawning. Realizing that he had been noticed, the hero crawled to the side as quickly as possible. The nameless queen remained silent, but her facial expressions showed how tense she was. Then, raising his palm upward, this familiar gesture intrigued Nate. But in fact, mysterious magical signs were appearing in the middle of the ceiling. At the end of the action, the possessed woman said that it was time for Nate to die. The hero smiled, although it was clear that he was now worried. Immediately, magical spikes began to rain down from the ceiling in all directions and directions. Responding with speed, Nate himself began to move. He twisted, dodging the thorns that almost touched his body. The nameless queen was amazed by the protagonist's capabilities. When the magical effect ended, Nate stood in the middle of the hall without a scratch on himself. Imprisoned in the soul prison, Udahi did not believe what she saw. She got the impression that Nate had been going on raids like this for years on end. Finally, at least one blow was dealt to the possessed one, then again and again, eventually starting to groan and beg Nate to stop. But the hero had other plans, because Udaka's health was already practically at zero. Later, preparing to finish off the red-headed one, at some point, the girl spoke in her old voice. Freed from the soul prison, she begged Nate to spare her. The hero adjusted his grip on the razor, not intending to waste his time on any nonsense. Udahi's eyes widened in surprise. An injection followed and the hall was sprinkled with blood. When it was all over, the system informed Nate that the dungeon had been successfully cleared. The hero smiled with happiness, because his plan had succeeded. In addition, a lot of loot was left behind from the killed players. Not wanting to leave such wealth behind, Nate began collecting everything. Suddenly, someone called out to him contemptuously. As it turned out, for a short time, the spirit of Udahi forbade Nate from picking up other people's things. The protagonist deliberately did not stop, which caused the redhead to utter all sorts of insults. In response to this, the hero only redoubled his efforts. When the collection of goods was completed, the system offered Nate to leave his name as the pioneer of the raid. After thinking about it for a moment, the hero called himself Standing Water. Later, Nate chuckled as he watched the recording of his playthrough. Nate couldn't help but congratulate himself on such resourcefulness. After finishing watching, an idea came to Nate's mind. He decided to post a recording of Udahi's humiliation. Later, a few hours later, Nate's phone was blowing up with notifications. Persistent, the messages came one after another. A new day had arrived, and the action was now taking place in a different building. There, in one of the apartments on the top floor, a restless roar could be heard. The people there, deprived of their game images, were angry about what had happened. But they were especially annoyed by Nate, who made the players look like complete idiots. Unlike the guy, the girl was much calmer. At some point, her behavior suddenly changed. Her hands broke the brush, and she reminded him who exactly had been made a laughingstock. It turned out that in the entire video, Nate only hid his face. Grinning her teeth, the red-headed one was ready to find him. After all, thanks to Nate's efforts, all her plans were thwarted. And for the shame caused, she was ready to take revenge. Gradually, her anger subsided. Still, she gained popularity. At the same time, a conversation began between the characters. It was about a young man who was in dire need of a job. The disgraced knight was already making plans for him. At the same time, already finding a place worthy of it. His gaze fell on the elongated room. The prisoners there were constantly arriving in the game. The friend's plan was to reach the player ratings and earn a ton of money. Later, the action moved to the place where the team of pro players was located. Those who were now also actively discussing the video of the raid. Pro players found what they saw strange. The guy in the video looked more like a monster himself. He moved so fast that players had never achieved it before. Moreover, performing any actions while being completely naked. Nate's strength seriously scared the pro players, but only one of them kept his cool. In another place, the company director ordered to contact the pervert. The director was so eager to get Nate that he was willing to agree to any conditions. Almost shouting, he demanded urgency and execution. A little later, a response was received from Nate. After a long sentence, the hero, oddly enough, agreed. The director immediately took away the assistant's phone number. While some were afraid of Nate, others saw him as a rival. The best player couldn't allow this to happen. Following this, the action moved to the game location. It was a new, dangerous instance. Where the local monsters were, the hero punished them. As always, his razor cut through everything in its path. As he progressed, Nate even found a secret cave. Along the way, remembering how popular he became. Already, Nate was recognized as a top player. He found this arrangement surprising. It was then that an elite monster appeared before the hero. Nate jumped and caught the slippery tail. He rode forward on the worm and pulled out his razor, with one precise blow destroying him. I did everything as befits a pro player, now believing that no one can compete with the hero. Sometime later, during a raid, Nate encountered a special sculpture. The statue spoke, asking for the request to be fulfilled. But Nate chose the option of refusal. This was the first time the special NPC had seen anything like this. With all its might, the statue tried to persuade the hero. However, Nate knew the catch with the reward quest. In this case, the statue changed the rhetoric of the request. Now, asking to find another statue and avenge himself on it. Having knowledge and cunning, Nate was thus given a special quest. After all, one day, just like that, one player entered the top. The joy didn't last long, because someone attacked Nate's ship. Using his speed, the hero escaped death. It was Udahi who finally found Nate. Then other angry voices were heard. All those who wanted revenge arrived. Looking back, the hero did not remember having angered so many people. Rizhulia laughed, saying that she had put in a lot of effort. The hero didn't answer, remembering Udahi's attack scenarios. At the same time, Nate was sure that the crowd had not come for revenge. Licking his lips, he decided to use those. A second later, the blades rushed towards Nate. They all touched the cloak under which the hero disappeared. Udahi didn't understand where those idiots were aiming. After all, thanks to his speed, Nate was already standing on the pole. Next, I suggested listening to myself, like a deity, offering to accompany him on a raid. The players didn't understand what Nate was getting at. Expanding on his words, Nate began talking about information. In exchange, he offered the secrets of the game that the hero possessed. Nate believed that this was why he was being followed. At the same time, considering your outfit to be unique. As he finished his speech, Nate was ready to share. After listening, Yudaka's lips trembled. The idea of a first ascent appealed to her. Besides, Nate knew how to seduce. As he pointed, Nate listed the players in order of importance. From tanks to general-purpose fighters. The latter are called expendable meat. But at this moment, someone else has appeared. He was a real pro player. The hero naturally pointed to him too, but then I was stunned. He didn't expect to meet Tegan himself. The hero could not believe that he had met the legend himself. At some point, sighing in fascination, reassuring themselves that with a pro player, they were not enemies. Suddenly, some giant beetle was cut into pieces. It turned out that the redhead couldn't stand insects. Later, with everyone's consent, the players went on a raid. It was a jungle filled with all sorts of dangers. For many of those present, the raid was difficult. Given the opportunity, Udahi decided to question Nate. She was very concerned about how Nate could know everything. The hero tried to explain that he simply found a map. However, the red-haired girl did not believe in such nonsense, following Nate stubbornly, then heading towards the tent. The hero sped up, because this was the entrance to a hidden dungeon. Galatea did not agree with this appropriation of everything and everyone, and so, hurrying, he went inside before Nate. Already there, under attack by elite mobs. It was only thanks to Nate's efforts that the night survived. One by one, creepy masks emerged from the darkness. The local inhabitants were going to get rid of the guests. Knowing the mechanics here, Nate was preparing to do something. He stamped his foot on the stage with all his might, thus destroying the surface of the dungeon. Since the circus freaks were tied to it, they received multiple damage. But not all of them died immediately. Having received aggro, all attacks now fell on Nate. Using his speed, the hero dodged everything, until I got to one of the nasty clowns, in mockery, driving his razor of fear into the clown's head. Afterwards, once again, shaking up the battle arena, taking advantage of the stupor of enemies and inflicting critical hits on them. None of the monsters could resist Nate. His razor mercilessly pierced everyone, until finally the massacre stopped. Galatea felt a quiet thrill from what he saw. Others, however, saw no flaws in Nate. The naked sneak destroyed the most powerful monsters in seconds. Meanwhile, the deal Nate had made was coming to an end. For their participation, the players demanded a share. Each of them argued that in any team, everything should be equal. However, not even all of those chosen by Nate shared these views. Rizhulia even thought that they were just pathetic crybabies. Only Tegan was in trouble. The consumable players continued to push their line, worried that the hero would not grab all the loot for himself. But Nate replied that he didn't need such things. Having put on a cute expression, the protagonist was ready to hand out all the loot. Then the players hesitated in disbelief. But in the end, he lost all his suspicion towards Nate. Only Udahi did not fall for the hero's speech. The redhead's face changed so much that even Gallatin noted it. Meanwhile, Nate was preparing to open the door to the next floor. With some effort, further weighty gates of the dungeon opened. The first thing that caught everyone's eye was hundreds of giant columns, in front of which stood a statue of a crying woman. Players who entered the new area noted that the local atmosphere evoked a quiet delight in them. Some of them turned their close attention to the statue itself. But time passed, however, in the room and nothing happened. Irritation began to grip the players, as they were expecting to meet the boss. At some point, one of them, the one most active with the statue, began to bleed profusely. Then the poor guy's head burst open, spilling all its contents. Further, absolutely similar events happened with other consumable players. The one who remained alive among them screamed with fear and incomprehension. Udahi's cry was heard, blaming him for what had happened. With her finger, she pointed at the crying statue. In addition, the hands of the statue were now also covered in blood. And the position of the statue itself had changed, which the players could no longer help but notice. Nate smirked quietly from the sidelines. He remembered very well that for 5 whole years from the moment of its discovery, no one could defeat the crying Galatea. The boss herself was simply a parody of an episode in a fairly well-known TV series. Not expecting any more deaths, one of the players drew her sword and rushed at the statue. Considering that one to be nothing more than a sculpture, she struck that one. The sword blades clanged loudly, but there was no effect. Pushing her aside, another warrior was about to destroy the statue. Her staff hit the ground, and a magical avalanche covered the statue. But unfortunately, she did not give in to manipulation. Finally, gradually recognizing that it was simply impossible to defeat Galatea. Among them all, Tegan only thought about the moment when the boss could attack. A similar thought was expressed by Udahi, who inquired about the boss's movements. But there was no clear answer. All we could do was wait. Among them, only the surviving expendable decided to inquire how exactly to make the statue move. This question caused a lull in the players' ranks. Afterwards, they looked at each other, gradually noticing that only Nate wasn't feeling any excitement. Rightfully so, Gallatin decided to find out whether the hero was up to another dirty trick. The only response was Nate's cough. Further, we will talk about 2 ways to get out of the situation. If in the first option there was death, then in the second, Nate only called it a victory over the boss. Udahi didn't understand what Nate was getting at, since no one had seen the boss's attacks. The hero chuckled, hinting that there would be no universal victory. These words struck Udahi like an electric shock. Then, in more understandable language, Nate showed the middle finger. After all, it was the hero who was going to destroy Galatea. Nate's manner of speech and plans made the red-headed girls angry. A second later, the D-class soldier dared to find out why Nate had dragged everyone into the dungeon. The hero openly responded that he considered the players useful. When he finished, he smiled. Then, asking all living people to empty their pockets, Nate called this action the price of survival. Moreover, the hero reminded that everyone ended up in such a place only because of greed. After hearing this, a displeased hiss was heard from Yudaka. Somehow, through clenched teeth, she decided to find out how much money Nate dreamed of receiving. Immediately, the hero announced the number 100 million. The girl became even more tense after hearing this. Drawing his blade, it was now Gallatin who threatened Nate for his treachery and greed. Nate yelped and pretended to be scared. It was now that the statue performed its next deadly action. Rizulia closed her eyes, actively blaming herself for being stupid and getting into such a situation. Meanwhile, Nate personally raised the ransom amount for Udahi, since she was now paying for her dead brother as well. The redhead's response was a blade that was held to Nate's throat. The girl's patience ran out, and now, not fearing death, she was ready to be the first to kill the hero himself. Nate was not at a loss, offering her an alternative in the form of a deposit. Moreover, he promised to return Udahi's money if she was dissatisfied with the result. Silently, the girl agreed and performed the operation. Other players watched the results of this scene. Nate kept talking, guaranteeing that Udahi would even take the loot from the boss. After all, the protagonist himself was not interested in her at all. What they heard caused shock among the witnesses. After all, Galatea was a previously undefeated boss, which means the first loot from her would be of relic quality. Circumstances tempted players with the opportunity to prove themselves stronger than everyone else. Udahi made up her mind, still unable to shake off the thought that Nate had fooled everyone again. But this situation was as dangerous as it was attractive. Briefly, she remembered all the other participants in the raid, and that the reward would have to be divided between them. Moreover, a video of victory over this boss would have made Udahi incredibly popular. As a result, the blade began to wobble in her hands. Slowly, the redhead put away the weapon, which Nate highlighted as an excellent choice. Immediately, the required amount of money from Udahi appeared in Nate's account. Another player did the same. Crying because of poverty, money is everything, even a consumable. Top player Tagan also didn't skimp. Once the transactions were completed, a smile appeared on Nate's face. In fact, the hero did not believe that anyone would take such a step. Udahi spoke up, demanding results from Nate, as well as all the boss's loot. The hero nodded approvingly in response. Afterwards, taking a step towards the statue, as he prepared, he announced that he would give a signal to the other players. After all, it was then that everyone should have turned away from the crying Galatea. Suddenly, Nate turned his back to the statue, snatching something from behind his cloak. It was a bronze shield whose peculiarity was that it reflected the owner's face. Now, ordering everyone to close their eyes. On command, all players closed their eyes. Meanwhile, Nate turned his gaze to the reflection of the shield. In the reflection, it was clearly visible how the statue slowly moved its palms to the sides. At some point, raising his clawed palm high, Nate managed to dodge the terrible blow. Then he dodged 2 more decapitation attacks, at the end of which, he stuck his razor straight into the dark area of the statue's face. The boss took damage but broke free and retreated back, now trying to touch the hero again. But with experience and knowledge of the boss's patterns, Galatea had no chance of defeating Nate. At some point, the veil of darkness fell from Galatea's face. She revealed her vile nature. Right now, the very chance that the hero had been seeking had arrived. Right now, Nate took a deep breath. Then he shouted with all his might, ordering the players to open their eyes. The first to do this was Udahi, who froze at what she saw. As soon as they looked at Galatea, the boss immediately assumed an indestructible form. Nate smiled, because in this way, the boss's attack pattern could simply be bugged. A second later, the protagonist addressed the players again. After all, now they had to close their eyes again. Without hesitation, the players once again complied with Nate's demands. Only Tegan was not satisfied with what was happening. Neither he nor anyone else knew what happened when their eyes closed. At this moment, Nate's battle with the boss continued. As before, looking at the reflection of the shield, the protagonist dodged Galatea's attacks. The boss's attacks suddenly changed as she began to actively hit the hero's shield, ultimately causing significant damage to it. Nate was worried, afraid that the shield might not hold for long. But the hero could not stop, much less give up. He recalled his best years, when he could single-handedly defeat almost all of the strongest bosses. So, Nate brought the Razor of Fear into play again. The other players continued to squint. They actively fought the urge to see what was going on beyond the darkness. Among them all, only Udahi was thinking about how to rise up against Nate in time. Suddenly, an interesting idea came into her head to watch, because then the boss could kill the hated protagonist. Besides, the redhead remembered that due to the lack of clothes, Nate's protection was definitely absent. Then, opening her eyes, she was immediately confronted with a notification from the system about the raid. Her gaze fell on Galatea, whose form had changed greatly. Deep cuts and punctures were clearly visible on the carved statue. It was then that Nate raised his razor, proclaiming victory. For Nate himself, this victory was a definite achievement. After all, with it, certain useful functions became available to the hero. Everyone was happy that the fight was over, but only Udahi was not delighted. After a couple of seconds, one feeling of indignation was replaced by another in the red-headed girl. It turned out that after defeating the boss, no reward was given. Also not understanding this fact, the other players looked at each other. But then, a special feeling struck Udahi. Wild emotions and crazy thoughts rushed into her brain. For it was now that what had been sealed in the statue of Galatea was awakening. The stone burst, and the true boss awakened. The players were shocked by what happened. After all, a refined figure emerged into freedom. The dispatcher even suggested that the boss was not dangerous, as long as he was being watched. As if awakened by those words, she opened her eyes. It was Medusa herself, a terrifying adversary. At first, Udahi did not even understand how her body quickly began to turn to stone. Only at the last moment did she turn her gaze to herself. The same thing happened to others now. The players panicked as everyone looked at Medusa, thinking it would be safe. There was a noise from the side and the red-haired girl looked there. She clearly saw a smile appear on Nate's face. Moreover, unlike the others, he did not look at Medusa at all. The other players gradually began to become indignant. Some of them even swore revenge on Nate. Pretending to be scared, the hero decided to find out if they really wanted Nate dead. But, among the stone statues, there was no answer. Moreover, the hero was sure that even with knowledge of the location, they would not have been able to survive. Now Nate had one last thing left, the desire to play with the jellyfish to my heart's content. He remembered very well that for the first 30 seconds, due to his peculiarities, the boss did not move. And knowing the attack patterns, Nate's chances were great. Moreover, the hero's bronze shield was still intact. From now on, being ready to enter into a new fight. After waiting a moment, the hero dodged the flash of light. Passing by the protagonist, she destroyed one of the columns of the room. Clearly nervous, Nate exhaled. Now I notice what kind of force made such an attack. It turned out that the stone skin of one of Medusa's captives was cracking and crumbling. The top player was back in action. Gatan looked at Nate with strong displeasure. It was the first time Nate had seen anything like this. Despite all the rules of the game, Gatan somehow miraculously remained alive. But here by nickname, Gatan called Nate. Having chosen a fighting stance, he challenged the hero to a fight. With horror, Nate assumed that at the moment when everyone turned to stone, only Gatan was watching the hero. This means that the process of transforming him into a statue was not completed. After a short pause, Getan immediately launched an attack. Using his reflexes and speed, Nate was lucky enough to avoid being hit. He actively dodged, not allowing himself to be damaged. But at some point, without taking into account the characteristics of the top player himself, there was a ringing sound as Getan's knee hit the hero's face. The protagonist survived because the blow hit the shield. Then, for a short time, a distance formed between the enemies. While he had time, Nate considered words that would help avoid further fighting. Meanwhile, the top player changed his stance again. He accelerated sharply and aimed at Nate's face again. But the bronze shield saved the hero again. This time, however, clear cracks appeared across Nate's only defense. Almost out loud, the hero was worried that in just a little while the shield would be completely destroyed, therefore dodging and no longer exposing him to attack. Finally, having bounced far enough away from Gatan. Even though the hero was dodging, he didn't understand how a top player could be superior to Nate in terms of his abilities. To his dismay, Nate admitted that even now, Gatan could be a solo player in raids. The top player himself, after completing the battle, no longer considered the hero all that strong, now being ready to end it. However, Nate did not exude fear, but only smiled. After all, everything was exactly as Nate had expected. The top gear weighed down Gatan. The Wanderer's gloves made his attacks slower. The armor slowed me down, and the helmet limited my vision. Even boots without proper preparation would be a burden. At the same time, Nate remembered how in his past life he was Gaetan's biggest fan. It all got to the point that the hero called him a mentor, and at the same time acutely experienced any tragedy. Because of this, Nate knew the attack style of any top player in detail. The hero almost laughed, realizing how much superior he was to his opponent. Finally, there was a blow from Gatan, from which Nate, as expected, dodged. Then he repeated this trick again. Subsequently, a relentless battle broke out. But no matter how hard the top player tried, he couldn't hit the hero. Gatan frowned, yet knew that he had never encountered Nate before. The longer the attempts continued, the more it seemed to Gatan as if he was fighting one big fly. But what irritated him most was Nate's constant smile. The top player couldn't come to terms with the fact that Nate managed to enjoy the battle process. At one point, even shouting for Nate to confess his secret. But right now, Nate's blade was approaching Gatan. After making defensive gestures, the top player pulled the blade away. But he ended up running into Gatan's leg itself. Having wounded him, Nate now aimed for the top player's chin. He remembered that for the legend of the future, this place was the weakest. The razor made a cut and Gatan's overall health dropped sharply. Feeling pain, Gatan even decided to find out what Nate was trying to achieve. The hero only snapped back, making it clear that they both would meet again. Next, Nate made his move. Not intending to lose, Gatan also carried out his action. And again, his fist slammed into the bronze shield. The shield cracked even further, and now Nate realized that Gatan did not want to let the hero leave alive. Later, the shield still crumbled in the hero's hands. Then, Gatan openly declared that he would get a new shield before Nate. The top player was planning to personally defeat Medusa in the near future. Like a mountain, majesty rose above Gatan's body. Determined not to get lost in her shadow, Nate began to brag. The hero declared that he could defeat Medusa even with his eyes closed. Nate refused any other explanations. At the same time, Medusa herself entered an active phase. Gatan didn't believe the hero, thinking he was bluffing. Meanwhile, distracted from the top player, Nate took a deep breath. Closing his eyes, he began to remember all of Medusa's attack patterns. Repeating to himself, Nate memorized all of Medusa's rare and frequent attacks, which depended on various factors. After which, he started a stream, where he greeted everyone who would be watching the recording. Under his hooting, the boss began to cast spells. Medusa's first spell to be cast was Hell Rhyme. Following behind her, the wave of flame thundered. Seeing no threats, Nate listened to them, successfully finding gaps. Next, start a series of dodges from the boss's close attacks. Further, slipping past Medusa, thus waiting for Medusa to use her third skill. It was a call that Jormungandr himself responded to. Nate wasn't worried, because the summoned dragon's attack pattern was simple. Listening intently, he heard the monster's tail swing. Then he jumped up when his body started writhing. The hero simply stepped aside when the monster tried to ram him with its head. Remembering the dragon's physical weakness, Nate began to attack it incessantly. After a couple of minutes, the summoned monster was defeated. Now, the hero only had to wait for the enraged Medusa to get closer to him. Just like at the very beginning, she will try to turn you into stone with her gaze. For Nate, this was good news, meaning that Medusa's health was minimal. Moreover, as an alternative to the bronze shield, the hero had at his disposal a bronze dagger. Once upon a time, Nate got it from the loot of the nameless queen, who was by default the enemy of all evil spirits. Finally, the smile returned to Nate's face. Now, nothing could stop the protagonist from defeating Medusa. Moreover, by applying the enhancement to the bronze dagger, Nate achieved damage of as much as 8,000 units. And given Medusa's aversion to bronze, the hero simply increased the damage taken by 4 more times. So now, it's time for the final attack. Medusa's eyes flashed as Nate opened his. The glow fell on the hero, slowly encasing his body in stone. But the bronze dagger continued its movement. In the last moments before the inevitable, Nate screamed at the top of his lungs. The dagger cut, and accompanied by a snake hiss, Medusa's head was cut off. The victory was achieved, and Nate was having fun. The system immediately congratulated the player on his victory, simultaneously providing rewards. Gradually, behind the joy, Nate took on a serious appearance. Among the loot, he saw the sharpened ring. Also, a piece of insulation from the first stage boss was ringing. After thinking about it, the hero decided that he would not show off the awards to anyone. Afterwards, his gaze slowly moved to the side. It was there that Nate made the jump. At the end, sitting comfortably next to Medusa's head. In this position, he sat opposite the boss's head for at least 3 hours. Medusa's eyelids slowly began to open. Speaking with obvious contempt, she couldn't understand why the player still hadn't left the raid. Nate reminded that Medusa had something to say. After a short silence, Medusa began a monologue about her unjust death. She began to tell the sad story of her hard fate and love. Now I can't leave my child to the mercy of fate, and therefore, asking the protagonist to kill the child and send him after his mother. The quest was received and Nate smiled, because it was a secret one. But he didn't have time to go anywhere, because a blue beam struck from the ceiling. Putting his palm under the beam, the hero thought that it was a drop. The beam weakened, leaving a strange key in Nate's palm. Even from the description of the system, the protagonist saw that dealing with this key was not supposed to bring anything good. One way or another, the narrative moved into the real world. Back at home, Nate was sleeping like a log. His eyes widened when he heard an annoying rustling sound nearby. A mustachioed bug climbed onto the table, staring at the hero. It even seemed to the protagonist that the cockroach was greeting its fellow. For the first time, Nate seriously considered moving. That same day, he went in search of new housing. In one of the selected options, the realtor actively described all the amenities that the house had. The hero liked everything, especially the complete absence of insects. A little later, when the video of Nate's victory over Medusa hit the internet, the director of a company contacted him again. The new star of the game was not averse to collaborating, asking him to send him all the necessary information. Afterwards, Nate left the conversation, as he didn't like empty words. The hero himself clearly understood that such attention was not without reason, and that they were trying to somehow deceive him. But having experience from his past life, Nate would not have allowed himself to fall into such traps. Walking down the street right now, something collapsed right in front of the protagonist. The impact was so strong that something simply crumbled into splinters. Nate was full of indignation, because he, an honest citizen, almost died. At the same time, a heartbreaking scream was heard from the upper floors of the building. The scream was so frightening that the hero was almost paralyzed with fear. As a result, he mutters under his breath that he will not interfere in other people's affairs. Amidst the howling from above, Nate moved quietly on. At the same time, in the building itself, unable to contain her anger, Udahi threw another monitor out of the window. Growling and puffing, she could not forgive the shame that the naked pervert had brought down on the redhead's head. After all, even Nate's paid video somehow hit the top views and got into the ratings. Sighing, Gallatin linked Nate's glory to the victory over Medusa. His sister continued to scream hysterically, complaining of unbearable emotions of frustration. At some point, the relative's assistant entered the room. But even he shared his opinion on how captivating the video of the victory over Medusa was. He admitted that, after watching all the videos of Udahi's deaths, he was now her fan. Unable to bear this disgrace any longer, the red-haired girl grabbed the bottle. Shaking a bottle in her hands, she asked her brother about the size of their guild. The impressive figure made Udahi laugh, and she decided that from now on, the pervert was in trouble. A little later, the action moved to the raid location of the game. Now, there were destroyed monsters lying everywhere, from the simplest to the elite and most dangerous creatures. Nate looked at this cemetery with bated breath. The circumstances of their death were unclear to the hero, especially since Nate had never been in this dungeon before. Trying to solve the mystery, Nate began to slide down a small cliff. It was there that he encountered a huge creature. The huge ogre growled as he noticed the hero approaching. The protagonist smiled, because at least one living monster was found in this place. Next came an attack from the monster on Nate. The hero easily dodged, not daring to answer. After all, the protagonist had some business with the monster. The monster itself, at that moment, lifted its leg above Nate. The hero smiled, knowing exactly what to expect. As if imitating the ogre, he also raised one of his legs. Both performed the actions, and between them a shockwave arose. In an instant, it began to diverge in other directions, pushing everything in front of it. Taking advantage of this fact and grabbing a razor, Nate moved forward. A battle ensued that lasted about 3 hours. Naturally, Nate defeated the monster. After which, he began to comprehend the state of the ogre when the hero met him. Everything indicated that some kind of combat detachment had visited this place. And just then, Somewhere ahead of Nate, a stunning explosion was heard. The hero was hit, and the raised fragments of stone were embedded in his body. Urgent, the system has notified that the protagonist has lost more than half of his health. Having hidden, Nate immediately began to treat himself with potions. Meanwhile, something massive was wandering around, looking for Nate. The creature's heavy breathing made my ears pop. Whatever it was, this was Nate's first time dealing with data. Thanks to the system, recognizing the giant as a Gorgon, it was a top-level opponent, with average characteristics and even skills. Suddenly, a certain player appeared next to the great monster. The figure moved elegantly. The polished wood of the crossbow gleamed in the player's hands. Nate froze as he watched the scene. Afterwards, the shooter began to move. Using the debris and his lightning speed, the player jumped from one place to another. On the last jump, pointing his crossbow down and shooting, one bolt after another inflicted damage on the giant. But the Gorgon did not give up, trying to catch the annoying shooter with her jaws. However, the player always successfully avoided death. Having landed on another piece of debris, I even sighed tiredly. Taking a closer look at the player, Nate grinned widely. After all, it was Drake himself, a legendary marksman in all areas. The fastest player, and also the only one who has mastered an unpopular class to the maximum. As Nate watched the battle, he remembered something else. After all, one day, Drake simply disappeared from the game forever. Thus, thanks to this riddle, Drake became more famous than ever. During this fight, Nate became worried about the legend. It was clearly visible that the Gorgon was gradually driving the player into a trap. Having let out a roar, the monster now intended to tear the shooter to pieces. Drake, however, did not radiate fear. Waiting for the right moment, he ducked and slipped under the clawed paw. The Gorgon was also tricky and tracked the player's movements, subsequently having struck again. But at the sight of the defeat, Nate saw something unusual. After all, thanks to Drake's efforts, Gorgon ended up right in a particularly sticky gel. Moreover, behind the monster, there were already thorns scattered. Nate was amazed, believing that it was simply impossible to do something like this in such a short period of time. Finally, quite out of breath, Nate appeared back into the player's line of sight. He was pleased with what he had done, because the Gorgon's health had fallen to a critical point. Next, replacing the crossbow with a sword, Drake was confident in himself. And besides, this attempt was far from his first. The hero watched this entire action in silence. A couple of seconds passed and then the shooter started moving. The monster's eye lit up, trying to turn him to stone. But at this, Drake only grinned slyly. Preparing to strike, he changed the grip of the sword in his hand. Then, on the move, throwing that one. As expected, the blade struck with all its might into the monster's only eye. But in addition to the physical damage, the electric arc powering the sword also struck the monster's eye. Then, without making a sound, the monster fell. With a crash, the Gorgon fell right in front of Drake. The player laughed, because this was the first time he had managed to defeat such a powerful monster. At that very moment, Nate emerged from his hiding place, yelling at Drake not to move. From there, Nate made it clear that it wasn't all over for the shooter. And indeed, a snake that had formed from the Gorgon's tail crawled writhing towards Drake. A couple more seconds and something simply unimaginable happened. A snake of even greater size swallowed the former one. It was the assistant Nate had called, who was enclosed in a ring. The danger was contained and Nate spoke to the shooter again. Turning around, Drake wanted to understand if the hero was the summoner of the beast. The hero nodded. Drake smiled, thanking Nate for his help in his time of need. Immediately, the system notified everyone about the completion of the raid on Gorgon. As expected, the shooter's rating was increased, and he was in first position. Besides, Drake owed Nate his life, so he was obliged to return the favor. The hero smiled, having no words of objection. In his mind, Nate was practically squealing with happiness, because he had received a promise from the legend himself. Subsequently, he said that he would have taken advantage of Drake's promise right now. The protagonist admitted that he planned to reach the very depths of this difficult raid. Drake was shocked, as he thought the raid was over. Without answering, the protagonist walked past him. His legs carried him towards the object carved into the rock. Based on his memory, Nate was sure that the passage was located behind the stone altar. After examining it for some time, at some point the hero finally found a hidden hole. It was now that Nate found the key he had once received from Medusa useful. After showing off, he used the key. Drake stood at a loss. Right before his eyes, the indestructible wall began to move. Suddenly, the floor beneath the player's feet collapsed. Flying somewhere down, Drake now knew that there really was a secret in this dungeon. Nate confirmed this by promising meetings with the final boss. For somewhere there, in the midst of the darkness, Basilisk, the son of Medusa, was hiding. Basilisk's story was sad, because he was separated from his mother. Sealed in the darkness all this time, he had been harboring anger towards the Black Dragon Homewrecker. Nate openly considered the dragon a worthless creature, since out of fear, he personally imprisoned his son. Drake liked the story, but he was more interested in the boss himself. The shooter's words interested Nate. Suddenly, Drake pulled out a crossbow and fired into the darkness. Somewhere down there, his bolt hit the basilisk. The bolt ricocheted, hitting the hunter's shoulder. Nate explained that this action is a characteristic of the boss himself. It just so happened that the basilisk could return about 90% of the damage. It was then that the basilisk, looking up, opened its mouth wide. The hero tensed up because the boss was about to exhale. A moment later, a scorching beam erupted from the depths of Basilisk's body. It was only by a miracle that the players did not disappear into it. Having finished exhaling, the basilisk slowly closed its mouth. Very quickly, the shooter determined that the beam also contained poison that could kill with just one touch. Without hesitation, the hero jumped into the pit towards the boss, leaving behind a puzzled Drake. The shooter tried to dissuade Nate, because the entire space below was filled with poison. He had no idea what plan the protagonist was trying to implement. Next, seeing how in flight, Nate called and mounted his kite. As it turned out, the hero had placed his bet on the summoned monster. After all, just by his presence he provided immunity to poison. At the same time, Basilisk exhaled again. Thanks to the snake's speed and agility, Nate avoided the boss's beam. As you move, prepare your razor. But then something unexpected happened, and the direction of the beam changed. The hero's snake slowed down because it was touched. At the moment of this pause, Basilisk was already preparing another portion of poisonous breath. But it didn't happen, because the bolt flew into one of his eyes. The hero immediately looked up, seeing Drake there, who was targeting the boss's weak spots. The hero grinned, thanking the shooter for his help. After which, again moving on to active actions. But even now, when he cut the boss, those cuts were reflected on Nate himself. It seemed as if Basilisk wouldn't care about anything. Now Drake has joined Nate, although he believes that the players won't last long. Suddenly, the hero agreed with this, even declaring that he should have run away. Having found an ascent, the players began to climb as quickly as possible. The basilisk raged and straightened its tail. Trying to catch the fugitives, he destroyed everything in their path. Continuing to run, the hero urged Drake on, because the basilisk would never let go of his offenders. Drake understood everything, expecting to return later, already prepared. But then the hero glanced slyly at the shooter. Nate said that he was not going to simply run away from his boss, but was luring him in. Drake didn't really understand this plan, because there was no way the hero could resist the poison. In response, Nate shook his head, admitting that he was thinking about it. In fact, he plans to drag the basilisk along with him throughout the entire raid location, gradually reducing his health. Sighing, the shooter decided to trust the protagonist. Thus, the chase lasted several floors. Basilisk, pursuing relentlessly, sprayed poison every now and then. As he fled, the hero even explained that he was able to recognize the boss's attacks by the drop in performance. About another hour passed, and the players reached the 5th floor. An hour later, the heroes reached the 4th floor, skillfully avoiding any attacks from the basilisk. The escape continued, and now the players had already reached the 3rd floor of the raid. Nate paused briefly, noting with dismay that the boss's health had only dropped by 20%. Having stopped running further, the hero stopped, trying to come up with a new plan of action. Suddenly, his gaze was caught by the sight of ruined columns. It was between them that Nate urged Drake to run. The shooter was worried about the hero's plan, because the exit was in a completely different direction. It was then that the basilisk appeared before Nate, tearing out the columns by the roots. From this action, a strange magical reaction spontaneously began in the air. The protagonist smiled, because this is exactly what he expected. Later, the magic took the form of a column of energy, accompanied by thunderclaps. Until finally, it hit the floor between the hero and the boss. From this light, smoke and flame, an ogre arose. With the addition of another age, Nate knew he had bought himself a little time. Standing behind the monster, the hero chuckled at the boss. He even encouraged the blue monster in every possible way. Finally, the titans clashed. At the same time, behind the scenes, a fusion of some objects occurred. Puffing up, the ogre pressed on the basilisk. Taking advantage of the opportunity, Nate continued to run. Along the way, explaining that the ogre's specialty included attacking any outsiders on its territory. Moreover, the hero relied on the ogre's strength, which should have at least delayed the boss a little. However, with each passing second, the ogre's situation became worse. The basilisk literally broke him completely. At the end, preparing his signature breath. While holding the ogre, the destructive beam finally burst out of the basilisk's mouth. Right before our eyes, he was disintegrating the monster, which was screaming in pain. By the end, there were barely any legs left of the once formidable monster. Nate was happy because 10 seconds of time had been gained. At the same time, I estimate Basilisk's health to be half of what it should be. This meant that the protagonist could try his luck. Naturally, destroying everything in its path, the boss followed the players. Thus, the actors reached the very 1st floor of the raid. To Drake's surprise, Nate looked arrogant, as if everything was going according to plan. Right now, using the new boots taken from the inventory, they gave a decent increase in speed, health, and other various features. Almost laughing, the hero announced that his preparations were complete. Next, raising his leg and preparing to carry out a devastating area attack. As soon as Nate's foot touched the floor, something flashed in his shoe. From the place of impact, the floor rose in all directions. At some point, shaking and instability even gripped Basilisk himself. In an instant, the floor beneath the boss's feet collapsed. From a gigantic height, he rushed to the very bottom of the abyss. Seeing all this, Drake could only admire what had been done. Ultimately, recognizing Nate's strength as terrifying, Basilisk himself fell from floor to floor. His talent reflected the damage received, which destroyed the floor where it fell and continued the vicious cycle. Chuckling, Nate watched as the Basilisk continued to fall, suffering. The hero savored every blow of the boss, every roar coming from there, because the boss was steadily losing a lot of health. Finally, after many minutes, having collapsed all the ceilings, the Basilisk fell back to where it had started its ascent. Having taken the last bit of damage, the boss's hand froze. Nate knew that even if the boss survived, a new rise would definitely kill him. But the option of waiting didn't really appeal to Nate. So, by means of the summoned snake, he began to throw stones at Basilisk. Along the way, I find my snake companion to be quite useful in terms of functionality. Only Drake considered himself superfluous at this celebration of life. After some time, the Basilisk was defeated and the raid was over. Nate liked the dropped loot and was already about to go down to get it. At the same time, a conversation began between the hero and the shooter about the usefulness of what they had done. Nate even decided to ask Drake for help in order to collect all the loot. To the hero's surprise, Drake quite willingly agreed to help with this as well. Next, a conversation occurred between the characters about Nate's nickname. Drake remembered everything that was said about it. Until finally, I moved on to the topic of ordering the assassination of the hero. Nate was overcome with excitement. Drake opened the system window to show orders to kill the hero from a multitude of guilds. Among dozens of accusations, Nate was unable to find even one that corresponded to reality. Seeing that the hero was worried, Drake suggested that he lie low. But in response, only the protagonist's gaze changed. Instead of agreeing or refusing, he simply grinned. And then he started laughing creepily. Nate found it cute that someone was trying to catch the hero, already in advance, imagining the faces of all those bounty hunters who were in for disappointment. Even in this situation, having an action plan, the hero planned to get rid of all those who wanted to do so in advance. A little later, the action moved to the location of the endless desert. Now there, under the blows of the players, a huge beetle was suffering. The players themselves could not divide the spoils among themselves. Cursing and threats began to be used, and the situation escalated. Soon, the metal of swords began to ring out, and the battle was about to take place. But then someone's loud voice stopped the upcoming massacre. The voice explained that the entire gathering of players in this place was present for only one single purpose. The players' gazes slowly moved towards the glittering stage in the middle of the hot desert. Like a Vocaloid, the redhead spoke as if to remind everyone that everyone was there to kill Nate. Some players were taken aback by Udahi's beauty. Without giving them time to come to their senses, Udahi asked all the players a question. In unison, they answered that they had come for Nate's head. But for the redhead, this answer was not enough. Skillfully, she continued to encourage the crowd. Through her efforts, the disparate army was united again. A little later, Galatea inquired about Udahi's large number of warriors. Rizapich honestly answered that in addition to her fans, she brought mercenaries, as well as players from China. Sharing with his brother a fictitious story about a reward for Chinese players from a certain philanthropist for Nate's head. Udahi admitted that she even felt a little awkward because of such great power in her hands. Later, thanks to someone else, to whom everyone owed the discovery of the hero, Drake stood in front of the redhead, explaining that he did everything for money. And yet Udahi was interested in the shooter's awareness of the hero's location. In response, Drake told the story that, like everyone else, he had been tracking Nate. It's understandable that Udahi considered Drake's reward wishes to be too minimalistic. However, Drake avoided answering, mumbling something about debts and guilds. Rizopich remained silent, her thoughts driving away the information that the shooter was known in a narrow circle of people. Having let go of her thoughts, she agreed to all of Drake's conditions. Udahi was about to leave when the shooter asked her to wait. The girl turned around with interest. For some reason, Drake wanted to know if the redhead herself was planning to finish off Nate. It is unknown how this conversation ended, but subsequently, a new day dawned. All the army gathered by Udahi was gathered in one place. The players brought in were on edge. Some screamed, demanding Nate's surrender, while others threatened him with cruel reprisals. Udahi herself, while preparing, held in her hands a special and extremely expensive scroll of lightning. After some time, in the middle of the desert dunes, the glow began to grow. It was becoming more and more concentrated, as if someone had used a teleporter. After waiting for the right moment, the redhead used her scroll. All the other spellcasters in the army did the same. They strained themselves and threw fireballs, ice spikes, and poisonous clots into the glowing area. All the elements fried, dried, and sprayed the area with glow. The final chord was that a meteorite fell there. Amidst the cacophony of explosions, Udahi decided that Nate had finally been killed. A minute later, the abundant flower crown began to subside, and the wind blew away the curtain. In the middle of the heavily damaged area, something shit-like was visible. The players from Udahi's army froze. The Sami girl was also completely confused. Suddenly, a large piece of turd began to move. It was crumpled and twisted until a camel appeared in that place. Once again, the players were stunned by what happened. They couldn't believe they had spent all their energy on the camel. Udahi herself gnashed her teeth, realizing that she had been deceived. But the anger did not haunt her for long, because her eye caught on something else. Somewhere there, further away, in the middle of the sands, something was breaking up the tall dunes. The hero watched the events that were about to unfold, chuckling. With his simple action, Nate summoned the underground monster itself against his enemies. Many players didn't even understand why the light suddenly turned to darkness. Blocking the sun's rays, a majestic worm rose above them. Dumbfounded, Udahi's army stood still. After a while, the worm opened its mandibles, making a roar. At first, the redhead looked at this creature silently. Then, experiencing a fear I had never seen before. A moment later, the worm attacked Udahi's army. With one movement and bite, almost everyone that the redhead had spent so long collecting died. Suddenly, the story rolled back in time, exactly 1 day before the attack on Nate. Events took place again in the desert. Smiling, the hero talked about the reward he had received. Drake confirmed this, although he added that Udahi's troops lacked discipline. The hero smiled even more than before, for he had expected something like this. Subsequently, making a plan on how to deal with everyone effectively. Meanwhile, Drake glanced at the desert. The shooter wasn't sure Nate could handle such a horde, but the hero briefly hinted at one of his ideas. Along the way, confessing his true nature, avoiding a pseudonym. Hearing this, Drake was initially dumbfounded. Then, at the top of his voice, he proclaimed Nate's name as the pioneer of the raids. Already in the present, there was confusion in Udahi's army. Only Galatea, trying to maintain control, ordered the attack on the worm. The survivors grabbed melee weapons. Just then, the ground beneath their feet began to shake. The worm deliberately caused an earthquake. Panic was growing, many were already ready to flee. But it was now, having controlled her emotions, that Udahi spoke up. Loudly, she reminded that the damage to the worm increased from the ice. At her command, the mages used ice attacks. The close ones plunged their blades into the main body of the worm. But there was little strength, so the redhead called for reinforcements. A little later, like ants, the players swarmed around the worm. While commanding, Udahi inspired the players to win. Fortunately for the relatives, they had the opportunity to make up for their losses. In place of the dead players, reserves immediately appeared. Everything was going smoothly, and Udahi no longer looked downcast. But then, the redhead was informed that the worm was going on the defensive. The player hoped that Udahi would finish off the worm with his attack. Besides, Chuck had one conversation with her after everything. Having finished speaking, his body flew away under the impact of something. Looking down, Udahi spotted a crossbow bolt. The girl immediately realized that it was Drake's doing. Enraged, Udahi now saw the shooter as his enemy. Now, having witnessed the death of my brother. After which, he began to examine the surroundings again. Among the rare rocks, the image of Drake was visible. Hiding himself behind the sun's rays, he prepared to shoot again. Only now did Udahi realize whose side he was on. However, Drake had already pulled the trigger. Standing nearby, Nate assessed the overall situation. Silently, he praised his genius. The battle with the worm itself continued until blood began to flow out of it. His roar became pitiful, and his body bent. A little later, collapsing next to the players. The players did not relax, keeping their weapons at the ready. Few of them believed that the monster had been defeated. But at some point, they began to emit bravura cries en masse. There was an unexpected shaking, and their joy was interrupted. The ground shook, and the players tried to stay on their feet. But the source of this earthquake was by no means a worm. Slowly, Nate descended from the sand dunes towards them. Proclaiming that only the hero had won, the players had no idea what Nate was talking about. They even considered whether he would really want to appropriate the loot. The protagonist did not answer directly, only hinting at the completion of the quest by other people's hands. So now, Nate was the first to defeat the sandworm. It was now that the hero was called by his nickname. Udahi flew up to him at full speed. With one effort, she intended to finish him off. And at the last moment, he finally hit Nate. Her sword plunged straight into the protagonist's chest. The girl chuckled at the hero's paltry defense. Looking closer, the joy left her face. After all, the redhead's sword was stuck in Nate's strangely colored skin. Nate's voice was heard shaming the girl for looking at her body. After which, he launched a counterattack. A special magic actually threw Udahi into the air. Finding herself in free flight, the girl squealed in surprise. She couldn't even understand what she was receiving damage from. Later, having guessed about the reflection. As it turned out, this is how the basilisk artifact worked. After the test, Nate appreciated the relic itself. At the same time, a familiar voice called the hero. It was Drake who didn't understand how Nate survived. The hero laughed, but did not reveal his secret. Next, he jumped from his seat, having started talking about the defeated army of Udahi. After all, thanks to them, the new item was at the hero's disposal. The new artifact allowed many things, but especially to survive even the end of the world. Later, Nate began taking healing potions. After all, with this artifact, his health increased. Afterwards, I began to rejoice at my recent successes. Later, he even began to jump around, calling himself the king of the world. Even though the hero looked comical, the shooter liked him. The hero stopped his fun when Drake expressed that he would not mind following him. Gradually, their conversation turned to Udahi, who was quite skilled. Their conversation was cut short. Just now, Udahi's reinforcements arrived. It turned out they were trying to challenge Nate's right to the loot. Not wanting to waste time, the hero suggested simply leaving. Afterwards, covering himself and the shooter with a cloak. To the player's shock, the opponents simply disappeared. Wherever they looked, there was only sand. But among this sand, one dune was moving. The cloak moved smoothly as it merged. As he ran away, Nate chuckled at the idiot newbies. Continuing to move, they both moved towards a safe place. And yet such male intimacy was awkward. Later, the action returned to the real world. On their phones, many people were watching Nate's guides. They really liked the hero's charisma and the presentation of the material. But some did not share this joy. This person was the top player, Tegan. Now, two big guys were looming over him. Tegan looked at them with a look full of contempt. The emotions on the thug's face changed. In a respectful tone, he wanted to know something. Unexpectedly, Tegan grabbed his briefcase. As he was leaving, Tegan ordered that the money be prepared. But without saying anything else, the pro player simply left. Bugaj was upset because he was counting on playing together. Tegan himself was in a depressed mood. He was not happy with his position in the game, nor with his earnings from it. Having left school early, he didn't know where to go. The pro player saw all his dreams as difficult to achieve due to problems in his family and school. Desperately, he tried to find a way out of this situation. The wind blew, and automatically Tegan grabbed the flying leaf with his hand. He looked at it with great interest. His eyes were looking at the rather tempting betting advertisement. Meanwhile, events moved to a completely different area of the city. Voices were heard loudly from a house in a small private sector. Those gathered there discussed the topic of inheritance with bickering. Being among them, Nate didn't understand why the conversation was about some strangers. Not long ago, the hero came to his uncle because he raised funeral questions. Often, when solving some issues, the hero's uncle would increasingly sneer at him. Nate honestly didn't understand why he had displeased them. It turned out that the uncle was dissatisfied with the protagonist's failure and lack of work. As an example, he cited his cousins scurrying around nearby. They looked at Nate with a hint of contempt. Gradually, the uncle began to scream hysterically, because, unlike everyone else, most of the time he was simply playing with the protagonist. Nate didn't expect this, especially from someone who didn't give a damn. Every now and then, Nate glanced around and noticed the children of other relatives sitting carefree on their smartphones. At some point, the relatives even tried to calm their uncle's ardor. At some point, the topic of conversation finally turned to inheritance. The hero became interested and wanted to know how much he would get. One of the relatives suggested the amount was in the millions, but his uncle didn't want to hear about such a thing, openly considering Nate not ready for such sums. Having thought over his relative's words again, Nate came to his senses, because those were a measly 2,000. At the same time, the relatives continued their important conversation, having already moved on to the topic of documents. Suddenly, Nate volunteered to help. For some reason, the protagonist took care of the paperwork himself. Hearing this, the hero's uncle froze for a couple of seconds. Then again, turning to yelling and accusations towards Nate. The hero chuckled, not seeing anything wrong with refusing his help. However, voicing a couple of excellent thoughts on how to make the bureaucratic machine work faster. In detail, Nate described the intricacies of this process. After listening to him, the relatives were no longer against handing over the affairs with the papers to Nate. The hero smiled and nodded approvingly. It turned out that Nate had learned such things in his past life. Almost immediately after the paperwork issue was resolved, Nate's relatives started talking to him about his studies. Some of them believed that the hero still had a chance to make it in life. Others offered more direct help with studies. The constant mention of college was really annoying Nate. Irritated, he looked away. The relatives' children there were still sitting on their phones. In an attempt to shame Nate, his uncle tried to portray the hero in their eyes as an example of a loser. In response to this, the protagonist could only sigh heavily. He had already imagined in advance how much pressure those kids were under. Humiliation and constant reproaches probably brought them to bitter tears. All these difficult emotions would be bravurely justified by words about good. But after many years, those who so oppressed children became worthless themselves. Alcoholics and swindlers who were within arm's reach of the noose. Nate didn't want a future like this for himself. At some point, there was a knock on the front door of the house. Being irritated and not expecting anyone else, the uncle ran out into the street. There, his gaze fell upon a huge truck, which for some reason had parked next to the house. Nate's voice was heard apologizing. Nate clarified that in fact, the truck had arrived exactly to that point. The delivery man appeared and opened the back of the truck, revealing the image of a luxury car. From there, it was carefully unloaded. The other relatives were shocked by this beauty. Even their children, for once, have torn themselves away from their phones. Approaching the delivery man, Nate signed for the services provided. Next, he opened the door of the sports car. As he sat down, he said goodbye to everyone, asking them to call if there were any problems with the inheritance. After which, I stepped on the gas. Nate's uncle could only swallow the dust raised from under the wheels. To somehow get even, he transferred his anger to the children of his relatives. Once again, he even tried to make Nate look like a loser. But only after what was said did I realize the stupidity of these words. And the kids wanted to be as cool as the hero. Moreover, right now, watching the video from that channel, the sports car itself raced along country roads. The protagonist noted that the important moment had finally arrived. I was really looking forward to an event that just happened. The action shifted again, moving to the Amazon, where a one-league show was opening. The host there welcomed both the participants and spectators of the event. As he spoke about the prize, exotically dressed people began to appear on the podium. The host introduced one of them as participant Joe. As if greeting the audience, he smiled with all his teeth. The host presented Tegan, under the pseudonym of Matthias, as his opponent. The faces of those were displayed on the screens of the audience. The crowd began to actively support Joe, chanting his name. Joe was known, but Matthias remained a dark horse. A minute later, the signal to begin the battle was given, and Joe went on the attack. A moment later, he hit his face with a fist. Another blow and Joe was forced to retreat. Joe was amazed because he was unable to track Matthias's blows. The pro player himself behaved extremely calmly at that moment. Slowly, Joe became enraged, considering Matthias nothing more than an upstart. With renewed vigor, he tried to attack again. Quick movements and lightning-fast strikes should have given Joe a clear victory. But once again, he only received a fist. Grabbing the chin, Joe flew back, exhausted. Thus, in the fight, the defense was counted for Matthias. The spotlights illuminated it and solemn music was heard. Tegan himself wasn't particularly happy, since he was currently facing newcomers. While waiting for the next fight, Tegan calculated that in order to win the prizes, he would have to win 3 more times. At the same time, the presenter warmed up the audience for what was to come. The scoreboard on all screens changed. Tegan was taken aback when he first heard of a certain Goinmul, but everything changed when he saw the enemy's gate. The general style of clothing, and most importantly the shoes, aroused a lot of suspicion in the pro player. For a second or two, he thought it was Nate in front of him. And yet Tegan did not want to believe this thought. Moreover, the pro player was confused by his opponent's height, which was clearly shorter than that of his sworn enemy. At one point, a voice from the mask urged Tegan to try his hand. The fight began, and the man in the cloak pulled out a razor-like blade. Taking a couple of steps, he challenged Tegan to show what he was capable of. The pro player looked at him haughtily. Then he nodded slightly. Following, in the place of his former stay, only a flickering shadow remained. After all, Tegan himself was already rapidly approaching his opponent. At some point, his smashing fist was reflected. The pro player didn't stop, unleashing a hail of blows. First on the body, then on the legs. Feeling the pain, the enemy let out a sigh. At some point, he unsuccessfully counterattacked with his razor. Taking advantage of the moment, with the help of the system, Tegan studied the enemy's weapon. He came to the conclusion that his opponent's chosen fighting style indicated that he had little health. Still believing he was fighting an imposter, Tegan decided to teach him a lesson for this. Changing his fighting stance, he invited his opponent to the last dance, after which he pulled his hand back, filling his gloves with magical energy. Then, with enormous acceleration, he began to lead it towards the enemy. The masked man was scared for the first time. The speed that Tegan was now developing amazed him. At one point, the pro player's fist even took the form of a visible flaming ball. This restless force was getting closer and closer to Goinmula. The crowd cheered, suspecting Tegan was a pro player. Still not reaching his opponent, Tegan himself performed an additional action. His glove transformed, emitting additional power. At last he was ready to achieve a flawless victory. In slow motion, Tegan's fist began to move towards the masked man. But it was now that the pro player began to think about the situation as a whole. After all, his blood enemy, no one was so slow. He didn't believe that Nate would show up to the competition just to lose. In the course of these discussions, the blow did occur. Having been injured, the masked man looked unwell. Tegan himself was in confusion. He felt that the man in the mask did not have even a fraction of the aura that Nate possessed. When the mask cracked and crumbled, a completely alien face looked at the pro player. Suddenly, the public began to rejoice, and the famous Koze himself showed his whole face. Besides, Koze himself is already tired of hiding his style. Throwing off his rags, he revealed his armor and weapons. From now on, being ready to defeat and disgrace Tegan. Waving her sword in front of her, Koze beckoned for Tegan to attack again. The pro player didn't hesitate and rushed into battle. Running up, he slapped Koze's armor with a deafening slap. But from the enemy's side, only a chuckle was heard. While shaming Tegan, he thought out loud that he was going to tickle him. Next, making a counterswing with the sword. Having barely defended himself, Tegan understood that another hit and death would be unavoidable. Tegan saw his only chance as increasing the distance. So, as quickly as possible, he began to back away. Koz burst out laughing, thinking that they were afraid of him. Swinging his sword again, he wanted to show the public what he was truly capable of. However, Kozi's blow was not the same as before. A rotating plasma arc was heading towards Tegan. Within seconds, it became clear to the pro player that the attack was remote, and so, without much difficulty, Tegan dodged. But due to the color correction of the battlefield, he visually lost the location of Koze. Right now, the huge warrior raised his sword over the pro player. Out of the corner of his eye, Tegan noticed it. However, there was no stopping Koza. With his sword, he chopped at what was before him. It is unclear how, but Tegan survived and even more, stopped the blade of the sword. Koz kept chuckling, suggesting that Tegan's life was at its minimum. He tried to get an answer as the blade slowly cut through the pro player's gloves. Tegan remained silent, straining with all his might to hold back the onslaught, at some point publicly admitting defeat. So, technically, the victory was awarded to Goinmul. Koz himself was dissatisfied with the outcome of the fight, believing that Tegan lacked courage. Tegan himself walked away in disgrace. While arguing that he would defeat the legendary Kose himself, there was simply no chance. Stretching, the pro player accepted the disappointing conclusion that the whole undertaking had failed miserably. Suddenly, someone said hello to Tegan. His gaze first touched the stranger's armor. Then he took the general menacing plan of that. The masked stranger stared at Tegan, but the pro player himself didn't recognize him at all, so he simply passed by. But even so, the stranger allowed himself to ask Tegan something. For some reason, the stranger started talking about the battle tactics of a pro player. Tegan was perplexed, because the stranger knew a lot about the pro player's fighting style. But then, the memory of the recent defeat overshadowed Tegan's rational side. He didn't want to answer, and in general, he didn't want to talk to anyone. However, the stranger continued to pester the pro player. This time we started talking about bets. For the first time since this conversation, Tegan was intrigued. After all, the stranger suggested that he bet everything on himself. Tegan's suspicions of the stranger grew, especially after the farewell gesture. Only at the last moment did he try to call out his name. Time was lost, and a new battle had already been announced. Picking his ear and nose, Koze again discussed the lack of courage of the Koreans. The stranger did not answer such a provocative question. This incident made Koze look at him differently. Smiling again, he urged his opponent to attack. In an instant, his opponent assumed an attack stance. Next, with his strange weapon, he pushes into the ground. Koze was surprised, because from the push, the entire arena began to shake, and the warrior himself gradually lost his balance. Taking advantage of this, the stranger performed a jump. In flight, in a menacing voice, he informed Koza about the beginning of the battle. Now, having approached him, the stranger grabbed Koza by the face. Suddenly, history was transported back a little in time. Then, Nate was looking for ways to make more money. After all, the hero's plans for the future were truly grandiose. By chance, with a gust of wind, the advertising leaflet was smashed into his face. Opening the sheet of paper, the first thing Nate's eye caught was the words about an impressive cash prize. This is how the protagonist ended up in an illegal league. But initially, only by betting, thereby earning considerable profits. Among the many battles, Nate froze the battle between Tegan and Kos. Even though they were rivals, the protagonist still believed in the pro player and bet on him, being the only one in the audience who supported him. After just 10 minutes, I was scolding a pro player for his ridiculous defense. At the same time, Nate witnessed Tegan change the trajectory of his punch. Later, having replaced the defeated Tegan, the protagonist caused quite a stir in the arena. As a result of the hero's daring attack, Koze suffered significant damage. Enraged by this, he raised his sword. Roaring with all his might, he swung it. A plasma wave formed in front of the warrior, burning nearby objects. It was now that Tegan saw something in Nate's tactics. After dodging, he used his new golem gloves. They had a number of unusual properties, including paralysis, which made everything clear to the pro player. As a holder of an unusual class, Kos was quite weak against melee combat. Moreover, under game conditions, the duration of the induced paralysis was fatal. Even though Kose tried to somehow rectify the situation, the battle was already lost. Having taken quite a few blows, Koza still managed to crawl to the side. Nate tensed, not ready to accept surrender. He pulled his arm to the side and released claws from his sleeves, after which he hurried to the goat. As he walked, Nate began shaking the ground again. This time, the wounded Koz could no longer cope with the shaking and collapsed. Trying not to fall flat on his face, he even propped himself up with his hand on the ground, only now discovering how the soil turned to sand. At the same time, through transformation, Nate transformed a normal claw strike into a vortex state. Unexpectedly, the story took a digression, telling about the character of Nate, who was called Madanvan. In the future, Madanvan was the image of one player who never managed to achieve recognition. The smallest bit of Madanvan's reputation was destroyed by the scandals surrounding the contractors. Then, a crisis arose in the underground fighting, and only by some miracle was the situation resolved. So now, using the image of the future, Nate destroyed Madanvan's reputation in advance with his vile actions. Already in the present, Nate's attacks did not stop. Despite all his efforts, Koz felt as if he was now being relentlessly drawn towards the center of the vortex. Feeling the sword with his hand, Koz saw his last chance for salvation. Perhaps expecting this specifically, a light flickered in Nate's mask. Koz was clearly frightened by his opponent's imperturbable appearance. Perhaps for the last time, he performed his charged attack. The swing was made and Kose hoped that he had hit the target. Then to his horror, Nate's mask appeared next to him. Laughing at this, the hero struck the goat. Then the second and third lunges. This was followed by dozens of incessant attacks. Without stopping, Nate mocked Kose, asking him to say louder what he was mumbling. At some point, the final chord followed, and Kose was completely knocked out of his armor. A couple of meters from the hero, he sprawled across the arena, exhausted. The presenter was shocked, because this was the first time Kose had been defeated, and especially in such a way. The crowd went crazy at the sight of the finished fight. Tegan, who was watching all this, was thinking. He assessed the fighting style of the new champion. I was impressed by the look of his armor and his overall determination. Overall, I find it wonderful. The story then jumped forward a bit again, to Nate's new battle. But that was sheer madness for the hero of the story. Something frightening and completely alien was pursuing the protagonist. Nate wasn't one to run from problems, though. Screaming and clutching the weapon tightly in his hand, he rushed into the unknown. Few people could have guessed how events could have come to this conclusion, which would ultimately result in a bloody massacre. Now, the story has moved back quite far, about a week. The events took place in a not very popular cafe. Young producer Yeon was worried that she had arrived at the meeting too early. Taking advantage of the moment just in case, she checked to see if she looked okay. However, she was amazed that someone extraordinary responded. It just so happened that while searching for her show, Yeon accidentally stumbled upon Nate. By that time, the hero had already become quite famous for his outrageous image and fights. Famous brands tried in every possible way to contact him in order to sell their products on the protagonist's channel. At that moment in time, Yeon wasn't sure that a man like Nate would respond. Be that as it may, from this attempt, Yeon in any case did not lose anything. Immediately, in response to her letter, the hero's consent came. Beaming with happiness, Yeon jumped up from her seat. Just like then, now, Yeon felt a sense of trepidation and excitement before the meeting. Moreover, for the girl herself, cooperation with Nate meant saving her career, and the entire company. The excitement was strong, so Yeon planned to speak only on the matter. Blowing into a tube, she tried to calm down. Just then, an unusually dressed man entered the cafe. Having adjusted his clothes, he stood and looked around the room. Yeon's expression changed, thinking that the same person had appeared. Trying to speak through the straw in her mouth, Yeon began to call Nate over to her. A little later, she met the protagonist. Every now and then, stopping and staring at him for a long time. Only through Nate's efforts did Yeon break away from this process and come to her senses. The girl giggled shyly, because previously she had only ever seen the hero naked. During the short conversation, the hero felt awkward, because it turned out that the girl had arrived at the meeting much earlier than agreed. Besides, Nate himself already knew Yeon. The hero remembered that Yeon's small company had improved virtual broadcasting in the future, which is how it rose to prominence. After a short pause, I started a conversation with Yeon about my participation in the general content. To all his proposals, receiving approving nods from Yeon. And yet, Nate remembered very well how Yeon's company, unable to really compete with others, eventually closed down. Subsequently, their conversation turned to director Yeon, whom the girl called a big fan of the hero, but explaining the absence of that by illness. Unable to take it anymore, Yeon wanted to know about Nate's content preferences. The girl believed in the protagonist, believing that his creativity would make everyone rich. This confidence in his own abilities somewhat embarrassed Nate. Sighing, the hero slowly pulled back and removed the mask. Next, calmly pronouncing the name of one unusual dungeon to pass. Upon hearing this, Yeon's whole face began to shine. After which, at the top of her voice, stunningly loud, she asked the protagonist again. After all, the Tomb of the Brave dungeon was a real battlefield, where players competed with each other in order to pass all of its floors. For many, this statement will come as a shocking revelation. Yeon, who had told Nate about the record held by Western guilds, which they had never managed to beat, was also alarmed. The hero found that whenever the game was discussed, the girl became hyperactive. But in any case, Yeon found this kind of content extremely fascinating. Nate could only chuckle approvingly at her incredible confidence. But beyond records and fame, the protagonist actually had a more compelling reason. After these conversations, at least 1 week passed, and the scene moved to the border of the Brave. While there, Nate wanted to make sure the broadcast was still on. In the form of a fire, Yeon announced that everything would happen later. First, Nate had to get into a certain situation, only after which the content recording would begin. Additionally, explaining to the hero how the dungeon was structured in terms of difficulty, the hero looked up, trying to make out the peak of the tower. He remembered very well that in his past life, they had never managed to get through the tower to the end. Nate was not averse to breaking current and past records, but most of all, he cared about advancing in rank. And also find some clues for artifacts. No longer able to stand idle, Nate informed Yeon that the fun was about to begin. After which, he moved forward briskly. Already there, in the dungeon, Nate faced a difficult situation. The unexpected fight was very difficult for him. Besides, Nate couldn't afford to lose and thereby be disgraced. It just so happened that some bunch of regulars of the game overtook him. No matter what, Nate swore he would overtake those. And so, with renewed spiritual strength, he rushed into battle again. Meanwhile, as an observer, Yeon felt confused. Before her eyes, something absolutely incomprehensible happened. Anyway, right now, Nate was celebrating his victory over the Slime Queen. In the end, Yeon squeezed out her indignation, since the hero spent a lot of time defeating the unfortunate slime. In response, the hero cackled, since Yeon knew absolutely nothing about the dangers of such an enemy. After listening to Nate, Yeon decided to shyly remain silent. Now, having passed the first not particularly serious obstacle, Nate warned Yeon that from now on, everything should become much more interesting. No longer particularly impressed by the hero, the girl hoped that he would run into truly tough opponents. Time passed, and Nate reached the next floor of the tower. The girl was absolutely delighted, because during the time that had passed and the floors that had been completed, the hero had not received even a single unit of damage. But now, the protagonist's further path was blocked by the giant demon. After looking him over, Nate even greeted the demon. After all, this meeting was rare, and Nate did not refuse it. After showing off a bit, the hero began to shower the demon with blows from his razor. The damage wasn't really taking hold, so Nate bit his finger with all his might. Then he splashes his own blood, simultaneously saturating it with the basilisk's poisonous fumes. The demon moved closer to Nate, stepping on the poisonous blood along the way. Subsequently, the poison began to penetrate the enemy's body, and the monster roared in pain. Nate chuckled as the blood trick worked. It was then that the demon's body began to bend, break, and transform. With all its might, the hellish creature jumped up, causing an earthquake. The floor beneath Nate's feet began to shake and fall apart. Such problems were nothing to the hero. After all, Nate knew in advance exactly what to expect from the demon. Moreover, by cutting off the demon's main power and not getting close to him. But even in such a situation, the demon could hide, merging with the surrounding objects on the walls and ceiling. In Nate's case, the monster was given away by its distinctive odor. After waiting for the right moment, Nate allowed the demon to emerge from his disguise and launch an attack. Having skillfully evaded her, the hero himself began to take countermeasures. Using the skill, he waited for the demon to start spewing magic. Right now, using my summoning ring. Summoned with a bunch of snake resistances, he took all the damage. Under cover of this, Nate pulled out the razor again. Next, he slipped under the snake in the direction of the demon. Finding himself behind the monster, the hero cut him with a girdle. Clinging to the demon's scales, he climbed up and pricked him in the head area. Nate laughed out loud as the demon's battle ended in complete disgrace. A couple more jabs with the razor and an explosion of dark magic erupted from the demon's body. Thus, the boss, who had never been defeated before, was defeated. After the battle ended, Nate even experienced shortness of breath. After all, the battle, in his opinion, took much longer than the hero himself had expected. At some point, he glanced sideways at Yang's light. Unable to bear the sight, she called Nate's battle amazing at the top of her voice. And indeed, the hero was the first to successfully pass this floor of the tower. Yeon was already silent about the previous floor, which was basically considered hell for players. Nate liked flattery, so he kept Yeon interested in him. Having finished with this, he switched to loot from the boss. Coming up, he carefully examined what had fallen there. As it turned out, it was the very essence of the demon. While Nate was grinning, Yeon herself was encountering such a game item for the first time. Briefly, the hero explained that the entity could improve, or even replace, any other item in the game. Next, combining the demon's essence and his boots. After this was accomplished, certain transformations occurred with Nate's boots. At first they turned black, and then, being engulfed in light, they rose into the air. Yeon chatted enthusiastically, seeing such mechanics in a game for the first time. Nate was pleased with the girl's chatter, expecting the content rating to be impressive. No longer able to contain her emotions, Yeon declared Nate's victory in this dungeon race without question. The hero himself was not particularly concerned about these cries, because he was already focused on something else. To take possession of what is jealously guarded by the lecherous Succubus. So, dusting off his rags, Nate moved on. At some point, his brisk steps began to slow down. And then something hit right in front of the hero. Having witnessed the incident, Yeon did not know what it was or where it came from. The hero himself guessed that someone had come. He smiled again, because Nate missed this meeting. At first, a wing appeared from the darkness of the dungeon. Next, in all her glory, appeared the charming Succubus. The Succubus glanced at Nate and licked her lips meaningfully. Yeon also noted her beauty, while also suspecting that Succubus was not a simple boss either. Yong's chatter was interrupted by Nate, who agreed to the fight. At the same time, the succubus snatched up her scythe and swung it. Using the talent of duality, the succubus's attacks multiplied beyond description. The boss's strength amazed Nate, and he wasn't entirely sure what type of boss he was. But after feeling the first damage, the hero realized that the succubus was a master of close combat. This incident was not a pleasant one for Nate. After all, he could hardly block the physical damage of the succubus. Having activated his speed, Nate began to dodge the attacks that almost destroyed this floor of the dungeon. It was incredibly difficult for the hero to perform this action. Nate wouldn't be able to hold out like this for long, so he saw only one way out of the situation. Following this, the hero stopped and opened his rags in front of the succubus. The hungry demoness became interested in this action. After which, her attacks collided with the damage reflection talent. Having returned the damage to the boss, Nate tensed up even more. Almost squeezing out, he was about to launch the magic blade at the boss. But right now, the succubus jumped as close to the hero as possible. After which, with all her might, she cut with her scythe. Another melting blow, and again Nate managed to escape death. Even though the protagonist survived, he was not satisfied with the results of what had happened. Taking advantage of the moment, the hero uncorked and drank the bottles with the regenerating potion. Luckily, in a moment of distraction, Jan warned Nate about the boss's new attack. After finishing his treatment, the protagonist was going to do something. Even though the situation wasn't ideal, Nate was ready to use his secret weapon. Then, opening the bag, he released something from there. With Nate's effort, the volatile substance was directed straight towards the boss. A couple of moments, and the succubus was covered from head to toe in a viscous liquid. Done by Nate, Yong's scarecrow. After all, as it turned out, this speed debuff was rather illegal. Moreover, considering this sight of a succubus smeared in something vaguely reminiscent of a liquid to be a perversion. A couple of seconds passed, and after an unsuccessful attempt to shake the liquid off herself, the boss became furious. Going on the attack, Succubus tried to cut down Nate again. And again the hero dodged the boss's blows. But this time, every miss of the succubus was somehow accompanied by an explosion. Nate even suggested that he had irritated the boss with the viscous liquid, causing a dramatic increase in power. However, the succubus's speed had slowed down anyway, so Nate saw a window of opportunity. For now, continuing to dodge the boss's increasingly clumsy but no less deadly attacks. Right now, receiving a notification from the system that the merge process is complete. After dodging the boss's attacks for the last time, Nate stepped forward with grace. His courage even puzzled the succubus. After all, now having put on new boots, the hero was ready to fight on equal terms. Smiling, he began to incite the succubus to attack again. The boss reacted by swinging his scythe again. Immediately in response, I received a kick from Nate. Given the new capabilities of the boots, every blow and even step was accompanied by a lava effect. It was this effect that Nate was projecting now. With all my might, I started kicking my feet underneath me. And also, actively kicking the succubus in the ass. Here and there, streams of lava spilled and gurgled, causing enormous damage. A similar tactic was actively used during the peak of the game's online popularity, causing earthquakes and floods. Nate himself found the new abilities effective, but was worried about overdoing it. Another victory had happened, and once again, Yeon was completely delighted. Plus, once again, Nate has proven himself to be a trailblazer, having acquired a rare one-handed sword as loot. While recording content, he continually praised Nate as an outstanding player. The hero even felt embarrassed when Yeon suggested that he resume climbing the tower. Unexpectedly for the girl, the hero refused. Later, on the services, the broadcast of Nate's adventures was coming to an end. As the host, Yeon thanked everyone for watching, promising more content in the future. At the end, promising viewers something extremely surprising in the next broadcasts. At this point, Yeon's broadcast came to an end. As this sweet ending progressed, someone began to pound their fist on the table. It was the red-headed one. Unable to contain her emotions, she loudly hated Nate for all the troubles he had caused her. Especially now, against the backdrop of failures and widespread disgrace, while being in less than ideal financial condition. Udahi felt a little better when Gallatin said he had already filed a complaint. Immediately, a suction appeared, notifying the redhead about a post from one of her followers. Utika's mood changed, and she filled the table with various foods. In the background of this news, including your favorite podcast channel. Exhaling relaxedly, the redhead was ready to have a good rest. Including the video, Ken greeted his subscribers. Intriguingly, he tried to make the viewers guess who the guest of the program would be. Udahi almost choked on her cheap beer when Kyung introduced producer Yeon. Once again, the entire building was permeated with her hysteria. A little later, Nate and Yeon met again at the cafe. The girl admitted that not all of the footage was approved by management. However, they turned a blind eye to this, because Nate ensured a truly fantastic rating. In particular, Yeon celebrated the end. After thinking for a bit, Nate remembered what exactly the shy cutie was talking about. History took a step back about a week ago. Then, after filming, Nate started talking about his compensation. Having time, the hero even imagined how he would break the record, not allowing anyone to catch up with him. Meanwhile, walking, at some point, wandering into the room of exaltation. There, in a special niche, Nate installed the knocked-out sword. Jan guessed that the hero was planning to strengthen the weapon, to which Nate agreed. Being experienced, with a slight movement, throwing the enhancement crystal. Before Jan's eyes, magic was happening. First try and luck was on Nate's side. To her shock, the protagonist for some reason did not stop. Where there was a second successful attempt, a third soon followed. Each time, the sword's characteristics became cooler and cooler. Before her eyes, silently, Nate continued to improve the sword. At some point, reaching simply prohibitive values. After a couple more power-ups, Jan even tried to stop the hero, because this game could have ended tragically. Not paying any attention to it, the protagonist used the crystal again. Once again, she smiled successfully at Nate. Jan remained silent, because the chaos Nate had caused in the sword's development defied explanation. At some point, I almost lost consciousness, because the enhancement reached the 9th rank. A couple of seconds later, Nate had another crystal in his hands. But this time, the hero himself doubted his actions. Images of his past life, filled with gaps, flashed through his memory. And in particular the one where Nate lost everything. Having realized this, a smile appeared on the hero's face. His hand now gripped the crystal tightly. Considering that he would not take an unjustified risk, Jan rejoiced at the unthinkable acquisition. Suddenly Nate used the enhancement crystal after all. At that moment, Jan's reaction, and that of all the spectators, was beyond description. The process began and the sword recreated a flash of light. When it was all over, due to failure, the fragments of the sword lay in front of Nate. It was clear from them that the sword could not be restored. Suddenly, Nate gave the light a menacing look, after which, he simply raised his shoulders. This attitude towards expensive things completely made the girl lose consciousness. Even now, Jan recalled how many comments this event had managed to generate. Nate himself promised that in the future, he will provide truly outstanding content. In fact, Nate didn't regret anything, because the fate of that sword was, in any case, sad. In my thoughts, planning to come up with something truly epic. The true hidden object, the thought of which made the protagonist laugh. At some point in time, Nate decided to check his phone. Unexpectedly for myself, I found there a message about approval for entry. Nate put the phone in his pocket and sighed heavily. Then, coming to my senses, the message really was important. More abruptly, he grabbed his phone again. Reading it carefully, the hero couldn't believe his eyes. As it turned out, the hero was actively sought under a false pseudonym. The man was completely immersed in work, simultaneously solving dozens of problems. The main one of which concerned the mysterious Madanvan. Suddenly, someone called out to him. The conversation again turned to Madanvan and why everyone was so interested in him. Professional player Lim just shrugged his shoulders, as he had no interest in the Underground League. Lim considered Madanvan a loser, since only such people participated in the Underground League. Moreover, being confident that Madanvan does not want to lose his big winnings and go into honest business. But the director had a different opinion, since recently, underground battles had been actively covered up. This means that Madanvan had to make a choice in any case. At some point, the constant talk about Madanvan caused Lim to become hysterical. The characters started arguing until the director's phone rang. Having forgotten about Lima, the director began to study the notifications he had received. Lim became wary when the process dragged on. As the minutes passed, Lim crept closer to the director. Only then did he realize that the director had fainted. With all his might, he began to bring him back to his senses. It turned out that a reply had come from Madanvan, raising the question of money. It just so happened that at some point, Nate became concerned and created a backup channel for himself. Who would have thought? But the fictional Madanvan managed to get an invitation to become a member of the national team. This deal was better than any Nate could have imagined. Reflecting on this whole topic, the hero finished his morning toilet. She admitted that there were a ton of invitation letters. But Nate refused all of them, as he was not satisfied with the conditions. And yet, the hero honestly believed that the current time was the most advantageous to force the government to sponsor esports. It was also a good chance for Nate himself to debut as Madanvan. Now the hero only had to make a plan of where to start. A little later, the director, who had rushed out into the street, greeted the dear guest. Radiating joy in every way, he led the man wrapped in clothes into the house. Quietly, through layers of clothing, the man introduced himself as Madanvan. Watching this, other pro players thought Madanvan was a bit strange. Among them, only Lim decided to find out why Madanvan wore a mask. The hero explained such preferences by the scars he received. Lim continued to press Madanvan with questions, which forced the director to intervene. In front of Nate's eyes, the pro player and the director began to bicker with each other once again. Nostalgia washed over the hero, because in the past, those two also argued constantly. The two of them were arguing so sweetly that Nate almost burst into tears from sentimentality. Chuckling loudly, he pulled himself together in time. After which, I asked Lim one difficult question. For everyone's sake, Nate reiterated the importance of Lim's presence on the team. The protagonist's speech led to the fact that Lim was acting overly self-confident, being a simple team player. Unexpectedly, other players began to side with Lim. Now, they began to reproach Madanvan himself, who was known only for his underground tournaments. The situation quickly escalated, so the director tried to calm everyone down. After hearing all this, Lim no longer treated Nate with respect, even considering that he would have run away by cheating. Believing that Madanvan needed to be taught a lesson, Lim decided to see who would go first. Some refused, others expressed their desire, but Lim did not like them all. And only Tegan, standing to the side, made Lim stop his gaze. His blue eyes slowly slid around the room. Tegan looked at Madanvan carefully, unexpectedly for everyone, refusing to fight. With this answer, Sun even assessed Tegan as a cowardly and faint-hearted person. Lim interrupted these conversations. Now, having decided to choose someone else for this role, but the event itself was now rejected by Nate, who simply did not want to waste time. An alternative option is to propose a fight of everyone against oneself. With these words, the action soon moved back to the world of the game. Despite the director's entreaties, Lim was not prepared to back down. Moreover, he was surrounded by loyal clansmen, ready to teach Madanvan a lesson. At the same time, Nate himself was preparing for the fight. Even in the game, hiding her face, she wore a special mask. A helmet was worn over the mask, in synergy, gradually increasing the damage of its owner. Next, a fighting glove was put on the hand, and the hero was finally ready. Sun even laughed at poor Madanvan. Juho threw up his hands, because that was the instigator's own condition. Choi waited silently for the fight to begin, and only Lim, with a bit of suspicion, looked at the horizon. Standing on the opposite side of the location, Nate assessed his strength. Under his mask, he smiled slyly, preparing a surprise. The director sighed in disappointment as he watched the player's performance. But even he, who invited Madanvan, did not believe in his victory. Taking advantage of the moment, I decided to discuss Tegan's refusal. The pro player reduced his motives to a banal lack of desire. Meanwhile, back at the location, Madanvan moved to a lighter pace. Unexpectedly, Choi came forward to meet him. Choi hurriedly wanted to show his teammates what he was really capable of. Even though not everyone agreed with Choi's decision, he was allowed to prove himself. Picking up speed, Choi drew his sword as he ran. Getting closer, he began to carry out magical attacks. Choi openly admitted that he too loved fighting, even as a healer, at some point, projecting a shockwave in front of him. After which, the magical glow rushed towards Nate's location. Right now, when the radiance was getting closer, the hero clenched his fists tighter. At the right moment, hitting the ground. This event came as a surprise to Choi. However, he managed to resist. He smiled and made fun of Nate's main fighting style. After all, at the right time, in order to avoid damage, Choi simply jumped and hung in the air. But then, unexpectedly, Choi was grabbed by the edge of his clothes. Afterwards, both of them together rose high up. Choi felt the air rushing towards him in the face. After which, the hero spun at hundreds of revolutions. Upon completion, throwing Choi straight to the ground. Having received considerable damage, the pro player let out a pitiful cry. Without giving him time to come to his senses, Nate was already approaching with a blow. A second later, there was a thunderous explosion. For other players, what they saw came as something unexpected. The director, who was watching everything, was also stunned. When the glow began to subside, a spiky image gradually emerged. The armored boots stepped loudly on the sand. The protagonist's kill list finally has its first person on it. Chuckling, Nate noted that the player's chances of winning were diminishing. It was now that Tegan learned of the hero's tactics. After all, he used the very power of fire, which is how he rose into the air. At that moment, Nate was going on the attack again. Sun advanced to meet him and a difficult battle ensued. Every attempt of Nate's attack was interrupted by the action of the rapier. By blocking the attacks, Sun intended to win through stealth. Suddenly, something slammed next to Sun. It was Lim who covered his ally with his shield. Lim was straining himself, which showed the sheer severity of the battle. At some point, Nate finally threw Lim away, immediately stamping his boots. The hero's other movements for some reason suffered. After trying again, Nate realized he was paralyzed. At the same time, Dream emerged from stealth. Having chosen a position, Lim cast lightning, at the same time mocking the hero's self-confidence. He even asked for forgiveness that they would attack Nate together. While he had time, Nate quickly assessed the threats. Considering that the main blow will most likely be dealt by Sun, all this made the protagonist think about making a mistake. Then, stamping his feet even harder than before. In an instant, a burst of lava erupted from underground. Lim tensed up, thinking that the hero wanted to repeat his trick. A moment later, panic appeared in his eyes. After all, the ground under his feet simply began to melt. During this period of time, the hero slept and became paralyzed. Like a hellish warrior, he walked on liquid fire. Lim was left in a state of confusion after what happened. Nate laughed, certain that pro players were not immune to this effect. Subsequently, starting the game by your own rules. Immediately, Nate lunged, causing destruction to the surrounding area. While defending himself from the fragments, Lim did not have time to finish the cast. Because of which, the cast spell flew away somewhere into the sky. Immediately, Nate's gauntlet sank into his chest. With a dull sound of impact, Lim flew away. Next, it was Sun's turn. Grabbing him tightly by the head, the hero effectively drowned the poor fellow in lava. Lim, who had come to his senses, urged those who remained to stick together. Now, planning not so much to win, but to survive. But Nate had already anticipated the plans of his enemies. By activating the whirlwind skill, he couldn't let anyone escape. After which, having secured his glove, he began to spin. The situation was tense and Lim gave the order to retreat. However, the last of his allies was already caught in the whirlwind. With a pitiful cry, he was swallowed up by the elements. Taking a short break, Nate began to discuss how insignificant Lim's efforts were. As soon as the hero compared them to flies, something unexpected happened. As they crossed the lava field, the frightening creature leaped towards Nate. A shining horn appeared, almost piercing the hero. There was shaking, confusion, and widespread destruction. As it turned out, Lim revealed both of his shields, which had the ability to transform. The hero was even flattered by this. After all, the #1 player in the entire country was trying to beat Nate. Lim responded to these verbal challenges with weapon attacks. With a wide stroke, he waved his shields in front of him, thus charging with magic, then carrying out an attack. The piercing attack was a failure. As soon as Nate ducked under one shield, another one came into play. The swings continued, and Lim rapidly closed the distance. Every now and then, the tip of the shield would puncture the ground at Nate's feet. Silently and relentlessly, Lim continued his advance. Everything around was shaking. The sandy desert was turning to stone. And yet, the hero was in no hurry to counterattack. Confident in his abilities, Lim even began to threaten. From now on, victory was a matter of honor for him. About a minute later, the hero's fist lit up. Lim just laughed at the attempt to break his shields. Next, Lim took the hit, but that one was by no means destructive. Frightened, only now did Lim guess the hero's plan. After all, the claw on his sleeve was firmly embedded in the shield. Then, twisting, Nate tore out one of the shields. Chuckling, the hero even wanted to know how Lim assessed what he had done. After which, he swung his fist again. Trying to survive, Lim put up his remaining shield. The hero considered such attempts to survive ridiculous. Then, only increasing the pressure, he squeezed hard and made Lim let out a dying cry. That's where the fight ended. Her audience was simply speechless. Tegan in particular was amazed. Before his eyes, the professional league was destroyed. Not a trace remains of the once glorious heroes. Impressed, the director was already preparing the contract. While he had time, Nate took up looting. At the same time, I was thinking about what I owed the victory to. At the same time, Tegan suffered mentally. For the first time, he wanted to be like someone. To be just as cool and powerful. Sometime later, events moved to a different location. In the castle of Malice, Drake felt uneasy. Nate came to this place for a reason. It was here, wanting to get hold of the last artifact. The hero never saw a better ally than Drake. The task was a piece of cake, but there was one annoying aspect. Hordes of zombies were present everywhere. By their appearance, they inflict debuffs. Not wanting to deal with them, Nate chose to avoid the undead. Suddenly, a wild cry was heard from the depths of the castle. Nate stopped Drake from rushing. After all, the voice from the depths of the castle could have been a trap. After which, for a couple of minutes, Nate simply waited and looked. At some point, he broke into a run and called out to Drake. The hero himself believed that helping someone in this case was unnecessary. Drake frowned but didn't argue. Along the way, every now and then hoping to save the poor fellow later. Soon, they found themselves in the interior of the castle. Right away, Nate saw what he was looking for. In the darkness of the stone walls, a figure was visible. It was an undead creature named Camila. Upon seeing the players, the undead immediately rushed towards them. Immediately, Drake pierced her with a crossbow bolt. Then he was surprised that the undead corpse did not disappear. After Camilla's destruction, a certain process was launched. In the midst of the angelic glow, the spirit of a beautiful maiden arose. The system notified players about the opening of a secret quest. Later, Camilla's spirit began to know about her destiny. The girl's difficult life turned into a terrible punishment, and she was extremely sorry that it all ended that way. After listening to the spirit's story, Drake glanced at the floor. Now, the players were asked to collect all the feathers from the floor. The shooter doubted the possibility of accomplishing this. Nate spoke up, deciding to explain the tricky part of the quest. With a sweeping gesture, he held a huge number of feathers in his palm at once. Next, slapping your foot on the floor. As before, lava began to flow from the impact site. The heat from it began to furiously burn all the other feathers. A couple of seconds and the number of feathers has been reduced to those already taken. Drake had no words to describe what Nate had done. One way or another, she thanked the spirit for fulfilling her request. As she soared upwards, she also rejoiced at the newly assembled feather pillow. Such a dramatic scene was wildly unclear to Drake. Nate remained silent, staring stubbornly at the disappearing image of the spirit. Until at some point, having flown high down, something loomed there. Then with a huge boom, the now blackened pillow fell to the floor. Smiling slyly, Nate urged the shooter to take a closer look at the object. Then, grabbing a razor, the hero stuck it into the pillow. With all his strength, he tore it apart. releasing black feathers. Hundreds of thousands of feathers scattered densely throughout the room. They rose higher and higher. They seeped through the ceiling, reaching up to the sky. This spectacle fascinated Drake. As it turned out, the hero used the item that changed the day to night. Suddenly, Nate burst out laughing, shouting that he had always suspected the castle's secret. After all, it was at night, in this location, that the secret door to the boss opened. Moreover, the hero explained to the shooter that on a natural night, zombies would be much more dangerous. Next, both characters began to look around. At some point, Nate saw a hole in the wall. Drake was surprised, because he had not noticed the hole in the wall before. Their discussion continued until a strange voice called out to them. With heavy breathing, familiar red hair appeared. Exhausted and worn out, Udahi now stood before the characters. The hero tensed up because he didn't want to see Udahi. The redhead also recognized Nate and was already heading towards him. The hero never expected that, despite his problems, Udahi would still dare to threaten. And so, without waiting for problems, the hero, pulling Drake along with him, dived into the hole. All this happened under the screams of Udaka, who, once again, no one cared about. Moreover, a horde of undead was now relentlessly following her. In a desperate attempt, she even began to beg the characters to wait. There was nothing to do, so the redhead followed them into the hole. The zombies themselves were unable to follow, as they collided with the lowered grate. Subsequently, the secret hole itself was sealed up. The story then took a step back a few hours, to where Udahi was preparing some content for her subscribers. Having arrived at the undead castle, she fueled the public's interest in the local boss. But in reality, Udahi simply wanted to write a survival guide for this location. Next, in close-up, she took the castle itself. Filming secretly, Udahi described the dangers lurking in the castle. In particular, she noted the strength of the monsters at the entrance to the castle. Now, I'm ready to show something to my subscribers. In response, she simply asked the audience to keep their fingers crossed. As she began her journey into the castle, Udahi began to feign wild fear. Squeezing out tears and screams, she ran from the undead. The dead themselves were encountering such controversial players for the first time, and only one of them restlessly followed the redhead. Corridor after corridor and turn after turn, until in the end, he knocked it over onto the floor. Udahi's camera took an unusual shot and then turned off completely. Having picked up her things as quickly as possible, she took refuge in the nearest room. Breathing heavily, Udahi admitted that screaming for tens of minutes was quite a task. But due to financial problems, the redhead had no other choice. Having thought about all this, she took a deep breath, after which she left her shelter. Right there, at the exit, bumping into a horde of dead people. With swings of her sword, Udahi began to cut down the undead. Her movements are fast and deadly, until the girl reached a new shelter. Having closed the door behind him, the ever-increasing dead immediately began to pound on it. Taking advantage of the moment, he deliberately rubbed dirt and soot onto his armor and face. Then, turning on the broadcast again. On air, she began to pretend to be wildly tired and exhausted from battles, telling her viewers about the achievement, in the form of the inside of the castle, which Udahi miraculously managed to reach. Suffering, the redhead began to beg for donations, which had the ability to help her. At the same time, in her thoughts, she laughed. After all, Udahi knew that during the day, the local opponents had fairly low ranks and could not pose a threat. So, the redhead could easily play her role without fear of taking damage, much less being caught up. And right now, the system has notified that night has fallen at the location. This information came as quite a surprise to the redhead. Immediately, Udaka started to become hysterical. Moreover, the zombies themselves have become more active. They clashed in hordes, beginning to actively move through the interior of the castle. Most of them came from outside the castle, and now, the door behind which the redhead was hiding was already breaking down under their onslaught. Fighting desperately, the Udahi began to cut down the undead. At the same time, finding out that at night, the death of one zombie excited others. Having destroyed the undead, Udahi personally accelerated the nearby undead for a while. Their greedy, cold hands now reached out to the girl's appetizing forms. Naturally, Udahi could not fight this threat. Screaming in real horror, she began to run away. At the moment of his escape, a familiar voice reached Udaka from one of the castle corridors. Gritting her teeth in hatred, she already suspected who it might belong to. Her brief hesitation allowed the zombie to approach. Not allowing herself to be bitten, Udahi kicked one of the undead in the face. Then, with redoubled strength, she continued her escape. As a result, running to the place from where the voice once came. That's exactly how the redhead ended up in that ill-fated hole. Having fallen into a puddle, she saw Nate next to her. But the hero himself tried not to pay attention to the redhead, and especially not to her reproaches. Finally, Udahi fell silent. After all, the whole trinity was now in the middle of a place where they shouldn't have been shouting. The long corridor was filled with a reddish haze and a strange stench. However, it wasn't just the familiar characters who were present there. In the midst of the darkness, the hunter and the hunted met. But for now, hordes of undead rained down on the players from the darkness of the corridors. The characters met them with battle. The The snake summoned by Nate devoured one dead man after another. Udahi also contributed, at some point, falling into a fighting frenzy, perhaps on purpose, once, even almost hitting the protagonist himself. The battle was won, and a difficult dialogue began. Rizulia had her own scores to settle with Nate, especially when it came to the current situation. With great effort, Udahi convinced herself that killing Nate right now would be a stupid idea. Moreover, the shooter Drake was obviously on the hero's side. All this made Udahi think carefully about his next steps. Ultimately, promising to become a valuable part of Nate's team, Udahi applied to join the team, but Nate rejected her request. Udahi was shocked by this action of the hero. Nate explained that even with Drake, he wasn't part of a team, but simply wandered around together. After listening, Udahi tried to convince Nate of her usefulness, without any claims to future loot. Then the protagonist started talking about the redhead's axe. Slowly, Udahi looked down at her weapon. After all, it was the axe that Nate was willing to consider as a bargaining chip. There was a pause and the girl frowned. Shouldering the axe, she admitted that Nate would never change. Drake stared at both of them, waiting for the situation to develop. Then, Nate allowed Udahi to follow him, but not to get in the way. The hero was curious to see how much the seductive beauty could withstand. Thus began their common journey. Along the way, Nate explained the dangers that should not be avoided under any circumstances. In another place, he calls on his allies to duck their heads to avoid being hit by an arrow. A little further away, it was necessary to move by jumping, so as not to end up in hiding, in the water, the fetters. From memory, the hero led his allies through all sorts of dangers. As these events unfolded, Udahi couldn't figure out how Nate knew everything. But Nate, as usual, avoided a direct answer. His knowledge and self-confidence greatly irritated Udahi. Nate himself was running through the memories of the moments, as if in the past he had passed this place thousands of times, even managing to never die. To some extent, even considering such places as my home. Suddenly, Drake informed everyone that he had seen a light ahead. And indeed, in the midst of the interweaving of flooded corridors, a passage flickered. Nate appreciated the shooter's observation, notifying him that he wouldn't be long before he reached the boss. As he got closer, Nate remembered what kind of monster the trio would now have to face. At the end of the corridor, approaching the passage, with the barrier bars torn out. Looking at this, Nate began to assert that something was wrong. It was then that a certain creature appeared in the middle of the arena. The hungry look and frozen, arrogant grin of the creature. Swinging the scythe, it was the Ripper himself. Drake guessed that the problem was that the boss, for some unknown reason, had been awakened prematurely. Nate could only wonder who could have been here first. Just then, someone else jumped up to the boss. A fierce battle ensued between the unknown and the Ripper. Every now and then, heavy blows from the scythe rained down on the unknown man. However, for the unknown, this whole event was more like fun. Using his claw-like arm guards, the unknown actively parried the boss's attacks. Along the way, mocking the boss and his inability to defeat the player. Having provoked him, he eventually forced him to strike a blow that went wide. But the Ripper himself was no slouch and actively wielded his scythe in various directions. Thus, still touching upon the unknown, Drake even admired the boss's skill. The unknown man himself, having missed the attack, was clearly suffering from pain. Meanwhile, the shooter also noted the player's courage in challenging the boss alone. However, Nate thought completely differently. For a hero who himself did not shy away from vile deeds, the presence of a stranger was theft. Now, explaining to the annoying Udahi that Nate had not come to this place for the sake of the Ripper, the girl fell silent and was stunned by what she heard. Even Drake decided to find out what exactly the protagonist was getting at. After all, now standing in Nate's way was Vale himself, the maniac gambler. Briefly, the hero recalled news from a past life, which talked about murders on the part of Vale, a true monster who covered up his murders with a game. And now this monster was on the hunt again. Now, the maniac was confronted by the boss Ripper, who was already in critical condition. After all, Vale's claws also dealt him considerable damage and placed debuffs. Vale was enjoying the fight, ready to come in every sense of the word. After waiting a couple of seconds, the maniac rushed towards the boss. On the way, he grabbed 2 crossbow bolts in his shoulder. Immediately, Vale glanced to the side. Seeing Drake there, he was already preparing the next volley. Immediately, the maniac's gaze became furious. Having quickly changed direction, his attack now fell on the shooter himself. Chuckling, Vale didn't expect to meet any other player in this place. Having finished chatting, he made another lunge with his claws. The shooter dodged and even intended to shoot back. But in the end, he was forced to go on the defensive. Coming out of the wedge, the shooter took out a second blade. Now, Drake believed the words Nate had once spoken. After all, not long ago, behind the scenes, the hero warned Drake about the maniac. The main advice the hero gave the shooter was to avoid close combat. These words, once spoken by the hero, fueled Drake's interest. Now the shooter wanted to test himself. Vale was struck by the change in the shooter's behavior. After which, a new round of their fight began. One after another, they began to strike and cut. In this confrontation, at a certain point, It seemed that Drake had gained the upper hand. However, the Maniac was simply luring the shooter closer. He was testing how strong Drake could be. And this confrontation was to his liking. Watching the battle from the sidelines, Nate wondered about Drake's chances. The protagonist knew that even in close combat, the shooter was not so simple. After all, what Drake loved most in the game, besides other activities, was PvP. For this very reason, his onslaught against the Maniac did not weaken. Drake's only problem was that the hero didn't see the best fighting techniques. Vale felt the same. In particular, the shooter's remaining health is low. It just so happened that during the fight, the Maniac's claws barely grazed the shooter's leg. Taking advantage of Drake's temporary paralysis, the Maniac strengthened his claws. Vale only had to carry out 5 attacks in a row, the last of which would deal colossal damage. Drake's attempts to change the course of events were already assessed by the Maniac as weak, but he even thanked the shooter for the emotions he received. When his claws almost reached Drake, the Maniac himself collided with someone's shoe. With his signature lava splash, Nate threw the bastard back. Luckily for Drake, the hero appeared at just the right moment. Looking at the Maniac thrown into the wall, the shooter decided that he must certainly be dead. To his shock, movement began to appear again in the body there. Sighing in disappointment, Vale wanted to know where exactly such brave people came from. His words did not touch Nate, because the hero had previously attacked only with small force, and yet the Maniac stood firmly on his feet. The hero could only guess how much health Vale had. During the attack, the Maniac kept turning to the hero. Vale claimed to have sensed something unusual, some kind of intention from the two players. Then laughing, he used the dismemberment skill again. With his claws, he intended to cut Nate in half. But suddenly the unexpected happened. Gritting his teeth, the hero urged the Maniac not to be unnecessarily surprised. After all, right now, having grabbed one of the claws, Nate broke it with his shoe. But the Maniac was not simple either, and therefore he pushed the hero away. As it turned out, Wile's shoes also contained hidden blades. Nate was pierced, but it was the Maniac himself who felt the pain. After all, the damage returned back to Vale. The hero grinned because the armor's damage reflection feature worked again. Now, without missing a moment, the protagonist put his razor into action. But he was unable to wound the Maniac because he parried the blow. Taking advantage of the moment, Vale chuckled, finding the hero's armor and weapons quite amusing. Nate snapped back, meanwhile emptying bottles of healing potions. Realizing that the battle would drag on for a long time, Vale even made a sad face. Meanwhile, the Ripper completed his recovery. For a Maniac, the presence of a boss in the fight was not the best news. The hero also became more serious, because now the presence of the boss had to be taken into account. After all, just one wrong step separated the Maniac from victory over everyone. Already not so cheerful, Vale waited to see who would attack first. And right now, his gaze fell on the redhead. Unexpectedly, the Maniac offered Udahi to join forces. Vale clearly saw how she wished the protagonist's death. This arrangement came as a surprise to Nate. The next second, the redhead became wary. After all, it was now that a mysterious and clearly abnormal warrior was inviting her to join the group. The girl made up her mind, not understanding how Vale was so informed about the redhead's intolerance. And yet, the offer given to Udahi was too tempting. Struggling with internal contradictions, the redhead closed her eyes. But her thoughts were confused, because Nate was constantly yelling, threatening her with consequences. At some point, unable to bear it any longer, she even barked at the hero, just to make him shut up. Nate didn't stop there, saying that he was simply warning Udahi from the bottom of his heart. These words and the manner in which they were spoken only made the situation worse. It was now that Udahi remembered how often and how humiliatingly she had suffered because of Nate. One way or another, the only thing Udahi could rely on was that axe. Finally deciding that revenge must be taken. After a moment of thought, she agreed to the Maniac's proposal. After the redhead's decision, Nate looked truly depressed and disappointed for the first time. However, Udahi did not want to hear anything, now, in a hurry to deal with Nate as quickly as possible. But after taking only a couple of steps, Udahi felt a sharp jolt in her body. Immediately she collapsed. Unable to move, Udahi felt her health rapidly declining. It was then that Vale's haughty laughter was heard. Looking cheerful again, the Maniac thanked Udahi for the borrowed regeneration. It was now that Nate realized that the Maniac owed this effect to the necklace on his neck. The necklace not only borrowed life, but also unfairly distributed damage among the team members. In this regard, it was Udahi to whom the Maniac transferred all the previously received damage. Moreover, Vale's weapons and armor were far from simple. Some had regenerative properties. Others imposed unpleasant debuffs on the attack target. Nate cursed under his breath for missing such important details of someone else's equipment. Moreover, it turned out that Vale had managed to visit many rare and previously undiscovered dungeons much earlier than the hero. Silently, the hero agreed that he had underestimated Vale, but Nate couldn't let the artifact fall into the hands of a Maniac. At the same time, Drake expressed doubts, believing that he should have prepared for the Maniac's new move. However, for some reason Nate started to smile. Right now, the Maniac's hand was seized by an inexplicable tremor. Vale didn't understand what was happening, only feeling the icy cold. The still-living Udahi grinned, as if hinting at her tricks. With a wild look, Udahi explained that she would take revenge on all her enemies. Then, somehow, with the last of her strength, she began to rise. It turned out that, thanks to her special weapon, Udahi managed to place a ton of debuffs on the Maniac at the last moment, the worst of which was sleep. Drake chuckled, now realizing that Udahi really wasn't that simple. The hero also spoke up, suggesting that the redhead planned to place this debuff on Nate himself. It was now that the boss achieved the twisting effect of the oblique. Just one attack, and the Maniac has already lost his head. With a heavy rumble, his body fell to his knees. And finally, it lay flat out right in front of Udahi. The survivors watched this scene. Nate was happy, because today he had successfully killed 2 birds with 1 stone. However, the boss was still present at the location. A new battle was ahead. But the hero first suggested that Drake fire a few arrows into the Ripper's head. The shooter did just that. One crossbow bolt after another hit the pumpkin, but not for long. After which, the boss's behavior changed strangely. The Ripper spoke and moreover did not realize where he was. The hero was not averse to chatting with the boss. Then the Ripper began to tell his story. He growled with anger, because for a minor mistake he ended up in prison. But now, being ready to take revenge for everything. He even invited the players to join him in his righteous campaign. The hero waved it off, since the level of equipment for such a trip was insufficient. In that case, the Ripper wanted to repay for his awakening. Now, getting ready to open the door for the players to the owner of the castle himself. Then, having imbued the scythe with magic, the boss swung it. A magical carving pierced the space. Subsequently, the torn area expanded to form a whole passage. Having opened the way forward, the Ripper now said goodbye. Nate was in high spirits because the secret path to the main boss's room was open. From now on, the hero could change history and become the first owner of the artifact. The magical funnel rotated, drawing in nearby objects. With a running start, Drake and Nate jumped into it. A moment later, they found themselves in a completely new room. But before they could do anything, a terrifying force began to tear apart the walls and ceilings. The great monster wielded its huge hands, as if it had been waiting for the players in advance. The sight of the enemy took the hero's breath away. After all, it was the already familiar Gorgon, but not a simple one, but a strengthened one. Gritting his teeth, Nate admitted in his thoughts that he never expected to meet this creature. Just then, several crossbow bolts flew into the Gorgon's head. Drake let Nate go ahead, because he had some personal scores to settle with the Gorgon. Nate doubted this decision, reminding Drake that there would be a lot of problems with the intermediate boss. Then, the shooter said that he regretted it, because he did not have time to personally finish off the Gorgon last time. However, now that he had something useful from the Ripper, the gunslinger was ready to give it a try. The hero made a gesture of approval with his hand. Drake was delighted, as he was looking for an opportunity to demonstrate his strength. In that case, the hero moved on, leaving Gorgon in the care of Drake. But first, the protagonist had to get past the mini-boss. The monster had no intention of letting anyone pass, which is why its greedy paw reached out to Nate. Right now, receiving several hits from the crossbow. Luckily, Drake turned the Gorgon's attention to himself. Teasingly, the shooter promised to turn the mini-boss into a porcupine. The provocation worked, and Gorgon stomped towards the shooter. At this point in time, much further away, someone was awakening. The being on the high throne tried to comprehend his identity. Soon, Nate himself burst into the throne room. His movements were confident, and the razor was firmly gripped in his hands. With each subsequent step, the motionless king became closer to the protagonist. Finally, the hero struck, but it was met. The counterforce held back Nate's onslaught. The king, who had been sitting quietly before, made a wide movement with his hand, thus having managed to push the hero away from himself. His unusual magic gradually took on the form of bats. The bats began to swarm, surrounding the king, as if faithfully protecting him. The hero chuckled in displeasure, since one blow for victory was not enough. Right now, the king's gauntlets began to move. Slowly, the King of Darkness himself rose from his throne. Then, he asked out loud who he was. There was no answer, and the King of Darkness extended his hand to the side. He spread his fingers, to which bats began to stick. Suddenly, he grabbed one of them tightly, after which he compressed it, under the influence of secondary magic, transforming it. The hero smiled, knowing the boss's primary attack, in the form of a bloody whip. The attack itself did not take long to come. Having memorized the boss's patterns perfectly, Nate successfully dodged. The boss's whip swung in every direction. His blows left deep cracks on the floor and walls. Still, accidentally, touching Nate himself. The protagonist clenched his teeth and grabbed the wound. Nate admitted, to his dismay, that just one scratch had taken away half of his health. It was now that the moment had come when Nate decided to take advantage of one gift. It was a potion that had recently been given to him by the Ripper. Then, the pumpkin-headed man claimed that with the help of the potion, the hero would be able to easily defeat the king. And yet, the method of using the potion was far from the most convenient. After all, it was made in the form of a lollipop, After turning the candy over in his hands, the hero discovered a mechanism on it. Under the action of the springs, a pill was launched into Nate's mouth. In just one use, the protagonist completely restored his health. But the King of Darkness himself did not stand and wait for the hero, but acted. Nate prepared himself because this was the second attack. By simply stepping to the side, the protagonist successfully avoided the destructive impact. This went on for some time. The situation amused Nate, even though he was getting out of danger so easily. As events unfolded, the protagonist recalled that in his past life, it took at least 10 years to get into this instance. But now, with the baggage of knowledge, the situation for Nate was completely different. Taking a deep breath, the hero felt his blood begin to boil. Decades of nerdiness played into Nate's hands for the first time. Now, more than ever, he wanted to get his hands on the last third artifact. And only the King of Darkness separated Nate from genuine power over the world. Despite everything, the hero wanted to get all 3 artifacts. Right now, bloody daggers flew from the boss's side. This was the 4th attack. Again, relying on his experience, Nate was not worried about what was happening. Knowing the intervals of time and the distances at which the daggers fell, he successfully made his way between them. Seeing the player steadily approaching, the Dark King released a stream of curses from his hand. The stream expanded, becoming a cloud that was meant to engulf Nate. The hero laughed, for the first time believing that he would not escape this attack. Eventually, the stream came crashing down on the protagonist. The King of Darkness, as in previous times, began to improve his magic. And therefore, from the resulting cloud, pins cut out in all directions. But thanks to his equipment and the passive effects there, Nate didn't die. With only 1 health point, he took the new Ripper pill. Meanwhile, the King of Darkness was distracted again, trying to find answers to eternal questions. To Nate's surprise, he had never seen such remarks, and even the boss's behavior before. After all, in his past life, the King of Darkness there did nothing but laugh tirelessly. He noticed that now, the current King of Darkness was completely different. There was no madness sparkling in it, but on the contrary, a sad agony. Looking into his boss's eyes, Nate felt himself begin to lose blood. A special gaze debuff that drained life from the protagonist. No matter how hard the hero resisted, he lost health every second. It is because of this effect that in the past, for a very long time, no guild could defeat this boss. With nothing left to lose, Nate decided to try his luck one last time. There was very little time left, so the hero quickly got to the boss. Nate's only advantage was that right now, the boss couldn't use his other skills. In addition, due to blood devouring, the boss himself also lost health. However, due to the much larger amount of health, the King of Darkness lost it faster. After a second or two, the blood devouring effect wore off. The boss realized that from the double damage, including the player, he would lose extremely quickly. Nate knew full well that at this point, everything would not end. From the boss's side, new magic was summoned. Multiple sharp tentacles now reached relentlessly towards the hero. Having counted their number, the hero believed that now the boss intended to win by brute force. A smile spread across Nate's face again. Afterwards, something strange happened to the King of Darkness. He bent over, screaming in unbearable pain. This is exactly how the hero's passive skill, once assigned to the boss, manifested itself. This poison was stronger and longer lasting than any other existing one. Right before Nate's eyes, necrosis was spreading across the Dark King's porcelain face. The hero raised his voice, deciding to find out how surprised the enemy was by this move. Nate was elated because he believed he had backed his boss into a hopeless situation. He estimated that the fight should have ended in about half an hour. However, the boss did not radiate even a hint of panic. Once again, he performed another piece of magic. But from now on, it was something absolutely unknown. The shadow around the boss began to widen. It was into this eerie shadow that the hero dived. Cutting through it with a razor, as close to the Dark King as possible, Nate stamped his foot. A shockwave was generated, accompanied by splashes of lava. The scorching heat, the raised sharp fragments, all of it was now flying at the boss. This incident once again forced the Dark King to resort to the Blood Eater. Nate was already laughing openly because the boss's patterns began to repeat themselves. However, the Dark King still did not look frightened. For some reason, a smile appeared on his pale face. The sight of her briefly plunged the hero into a stupor. The hero's sixth sense told him that something was wrong. And then, completely by accident, Nate looked up. A dark cloud hung and seethed right above him. The hero was shocked, seeing the boss use 2 special attacks at once for the first time. There was nothing to do, so Nate relied on the resistance of his armor. Besides, he still had some gifts in stock. Taking out the Ripper's sweets, Nate immediately began pouring them into his mouth. After which, 2 special attacks were nevertheless unleashed on the hero. The boss kept his magic in motion relentlessly. All this went on for some time, as if marinating Nate. Under the impact of 2 special attacks, the hero's armor began to crack. Penetrating through them, the magic caused damage directly to the body itself. And yet the hero held on. When his health became critically low, Nate used the Ripper pills. The tedious struggle with time itself began. It all depended on which of the opponents would run out of health faster, but Nate also counted on the cooldown of certain skills. Specifically, it lasted until the damage reflection cooldown was complete. A couple of moments and the skill worked. With terrible force, all the damage Nate had previously received was now returned to the Dark King. Seeing this, the boss stopped casting and began to back away, but dozens of thorns caught up with him first, piercing and disfiguring the boss in every possible way. Nate himself continued to seethe with rage, maintaining the action of the reflection. Gradually, his body grew weaker, and his eyelids grew heavy, but the empty darkness did not take hold of him for long, because Drake arrived in time. Having stirred Nate, he brought him into order. The shooter briefly explained that he reached the hero only an hour later. When the conversation turned to the boss, Drake pointed somewhere behind himself. There, the pale figure of the Dark King was visible. Still showing signs of life, the boss quietly whispered something. The boss was worried not only about himself, he was also concerned about the fate of those for whom he was responsible. Nate stepped forward and listened, after which, he joyfully announced that the idea had worked. Meanwhile, the boss's body began to disintegrate before our eyes. An unknown force pulled him into one point, until there was no trace left of the King of Darkness. Following the death of the boss, the system implemented loot drop. Reaching into the light, Nate pulled out the Blood Eater ring itself. The protagonist almost screamed, because finally, all 3 important artifacts were collected. From now on, having at his disposal a set that allowed Nate to survive in absolutely any fight. But this also meant that Nate's chosen tactics were successful and possible to implement. Drake was happy for the hero. Moreover, thanks to Nate's efforts, the shooter achieved his own goals. With great interest and pleasure, he dealt with the Gorgon. In response, Nate smiled and nodded his head. Afterwards, marking the end of the raid, the players bumped fists. But then, messages from the system started pouring in, because the hero still hadn't received the main prize. Nate had no idea what was going on. At that very moment, a glow was heard from the direction of the Dark King's throne. The light was asleep and now a chest was visible there. At the same time, the hero glanced at the ring he had received, which was supposed to be the main reward. Still, he had no idea what might be hidden in the chest. He cautiously reached out to the chest, thinking it might be a trap. Nate's imagination warned him that the chest might be a mimic. Overcoming his fear, the protagonist lifted the lid. On a soft lining, watching the necklace, it was the necklace of the miracle-working King Solomon himself. Quickly, the hero remembered what kind of jokes he could make. Only now, holding the necklace in his hands, did it dawn on Nate that the Dark King and Solomon were one and the same person. A smile appeared on Nate's face as the hidden quest was activated. Immediately, a package containing the assignment materialized in his hand. It told the story of the epic fall of King Solomon. Having become a victim of the demon's meanness, King Solomon asked for revenge. This story was too long and incredibly boring, so Nate skipped it. The work was done, the quest was accepted, and Nate was now happy with the loot he had received. But before setting off to complete the missions, the hero considered it more advisable to try out the new set he had knocked out. Subsequently, events moved to the real world. Not being in the best mood, Nate talked on the phone. He asked to pay his fine quickly, since he had recently said too much. A little later, the hero finally returned to his luxurious apartments. In the middle of Nate's home, the phone was ringing loudly. The ringing continued for a long time. Finally, Nate's hand reached out to the phone. As it turned out, all this time, Jan was actively trying to get through to the hero. The protagonist was even glad to hear her voice. The girl chatted so quickly and actively that after just a couple of seconds, Nate was tired. At some point, unable to bear it any longer, the protagonist agreed to save Jan's phone number. The hero even reported exactly what he named the saved contact. Jan liked the option, but while actively flirting, she hinted at a couple of emojis in the title. Later, we started talking about the essence of the call, or rather the invitation for Nate to the show. The hero did not refuse, but did not promise anything either. The girl wasn't entirely satisfied with the answer, so she tried to lure the hero with desserts. Continuing to persuade, the girl told me about a certain restaurant that served interesting dishes. It was then, listening to Yeon's sweet chirping, that the hero turned on the blender at full blast. Only after Yeon's screams were so loud that the hero came to his senses and apologized. Having calmed down, the girl secretly told her what plans she had for her show. Hearing this, the hero did not seem particularly interested. The girl immediately explained that the special guest would not be able to profit from the interview. At the same time, it was made known that the special guest would be secretly watched from now on. With Yong's stories in mind, Nate eventually created a disgusting tasting but healing cocktail. Finally, the girl confided that he was a special guest who loved to participate in an underground league. Already suspecting who they were talking about, the hero even decided to bet on his knowledge. If Nate won, the girl promised to go on a date with him. She was upset when the protagonist converted personal meetings into streaming sessions. In any case, Jan didn't think Nate would be able to guess. Then suddenly Nate called Mado's name. Hearing this name, Jan choked and began coughing into the phone. The girl was at a loss, not knowing how the hero managed to guess. Gradually, their conversation turned to the interesting qualities of this guest. Playing along, Nate concluded that Mado was an incredible person. Their conversation ended, and Nate was glad that he had managed to lure Yeon to his streams. After all, with her popularity, the hero himself will begin to gain fame. At the same time, the director of the national team called the fake persona for a conversation. After reading the message, Nate urgently took off his old clothes. The hero was preparing to appear in his second guise. He smiled, feeling how plans in real life were becoming reality. Then jumping into his car, he started it up in a flash. Leaving dust behind, the car rushed off. Nate had high hopes for his chances, especially with such influential friends. He became so self-assertive that he even began to drive recklessly on the road, shouting at the top of his lungs that no one will stop him anymore. That was until Nate was arrested for driving naked. Later, after a fine and a conversation, he was forced to dress up. After finally reaching the director, in his office, the director started an uncomfortable conversation for Nate regarding his identity. Using semantic turns, the director led to the need to reveal Nate's identity. The protagonist was not afraid of publicity, but first he wanted to discuss the topic of salary. The director hesitated, but Nate knew that after the league, his popularity would rise to unprecedented heights. In other words, the hero was ready to drag out time and raise his price. And so, turning around, Nate began to threaten to sign contracts with other organizations. Nate's business acumen and self-confidence somewhat irritated the director. Ultimately, having made certain concessions, the director laid out the map on the table. While making notes on the map, he explained which other teams would be participating. Next, getting ready to tell the hero about the upcoming enemies. So, the elite will be facing the hero and the national team. It was a commercial team, known for its impeccable victories. The elite was already powerful, but recently they have strengthened their lineup with newcomers. The director described the new recruits as skilled fighters with a unique fighting style. As an ace in the hole, the director nominated his own players. Reading the names of his opponents, the hero found them familiar to him from his past life. Nate remembered very well how exactly this team battle had taken place in his past life. It was the hottest event, which the whole country followed. Then, for a considerable amount of money, Nate managed to get into the front rows of the audience. Moreover, trying to get rich on bets. A few days later, a new league started, with exactly the same rules. The audience roared to the stunning music. Under the spotlights and haze, the host introduced the elite. The first to show up was the captain of the elite, named Eugene. Behind him, his right hand, Mr. Gin, appeared. Then, as they were introduced for the first time, the smiles of the newcomers began to shine. The crowd gave a full salute to the great winners of past competitions. The team responded by raising their hands to greet the crowd. Suddenly, Eugene greeted everyone loudly. A wave of hysteria swept through the public again. A minute later, the host introduced the elite's opponents. To the same music and fanfare, the national team players walked out onto the podium. The audience was similarly ecstatic, especially from Lim's face. The other team members were not ignored either. Among them, only Tegan had the least number of fans. The last person in the group to step onto the podium was a man in a mask, but no one in the public knew that. Even for the host, it was a revelation that Healer Choi was not taken to the competition. Eugene from the elite assessed his opponents as upstarts from the street. He didn't consider the dark horse in the form of Nate a threat at all. Finally, when all the greetings were finished, the leader announced the start of the battle. Afterwards, by random selection, the duel was announced between the first fighters. The players selected for the battle cheerfully headed to the capsules. Even inside, the players could clearly hear the spectators chanting the fighters' names. A second later, the immersion process started. It all ended when a desert location appeared before the fighters' eyes. Having taken a couple of steps towards each other, the opponents drew level. In the real world, the situation in the game was displayed on all the boards and screens. The director closely followed the course of events, and yet certain doubts assailed him. After all, not long ago, the hero asked to send Tegan himself as the first fighter. Then, as an argument, Nate mentioned Tegan's skills. It was at that moment that Juice appeared, approving of the protagonist's choice. Sok openly believed it was time to let Tegan prove himself. After all, the potential of the Fistmaster was truly high. Now, however, an opponent from the elite held a completely different opinion about Tegan. Knowing little about Tegan's background, he didn't expect any resistance. After a few seconds of waiting, Tegan took off. Right away, he demonstrated his signature strike. The elite fighter survived, but did not expect such an onslaught. After all, despite the block, the damage still happened. At the same moment, another blow followed. A powerful push sent the opponent flying to the side. Suffering damage, the enemy admitted the error of his assumptions regarding Tegan. Having recovered, he now personally went on the attack. With a two-handed weapon, performing a skill-charged swing. The opponent smiled, because the poison damage had passed, hoping that Tegan would become confused and open a hole in the defense. Typically, in such situations, both opponents would move to the side. However, Tegan was not one of them. For some unknown reason, he stubbornly approached the enemy. For Captain Alita, the following event came as a shock. After all, Tegan's Thunderglove had dug into the enemy's body. With the sound of bones crunching, the elite fighter was lifted into the air. Tegan seemed to be enjoying the process. Looking on from the outside, Nate noted Tegan's efforts. At the same time, the presenter announced the victory of the pro player. The director also rejoiced at this event. Nate also did not hide his emotions of joy, after a long time, once again seeing the magnificence of Tegan. And yet, the hero clearly remembered how in the past, the team lost. But he had no intention of grieving over this. After all, the future was now being changed by Nate himself. Besides, this time the hero's bets could not lose. At the same time, Tegan did not change. To meet him, the elite sent a second fighter. Tegan tensed up at the sight of the heavyweight goon. Gin provoked the pro player to make the first move. About 10 minutes later, he too was sent into flight. With the last of his strength, Gin tried to understand where he had gone wrong. Tegan himself was barely sweating from the effort he had put in. After all, the tactics of the battle with Gin were extremely simple. At the right moment, simply driving him into a stupor. Gin was still alive and was now worried about his defeat. Rather than die, he chose a replacement player. A portal opened and a newbie girl came out of it. It was the promising warrior Bin. At some point, the newbie took something and began to rub it between her fingers. Next, blow out the crushed seeds. As the seeds flew, some transformations occurred. In just a few moments, they populated the barren desert with plants. Before Tegan could even realize it, he found himself in the middle of dense greenery. The hero knew this technique because the plants were poisonous. Suddenly, there was a new change of players. With a special curved blade, Lin ran towards the pro player. Tegan naturally went out to intercept her. But as soon as he took a step, his shoe got stuck in something. Lin herself at that moment changed her weapon. She drew her bow and released the arrow. However, right now, the arrow has been deflected. With a swing of his fist, Tegan hit her. Further, again making a swing. With all his might, hitting the ground. The resulting shockwave began to destroy the grass. The plants were burning and some even thought that Tegan would harm himself. However, such a trifle could not deter the pro player. But in response, an electrified movement unfolded. After all, once again, there was a change of players. The swordswoman pressed Tegan in every possible way. For the first time during this battle, Tegan became worried. After all, the swordswoman was fast and dangerous in her attacks. Due to the danger of the situation, the director called for change. Meanwhile, Nate has a completely different opinion. Even in case of defeat, the hero considered the best option for Taganu to die. Knowing their conversation for sure, the pro player continued the fight. But the swordswoman didn't allow him to get too carried away. Lightning strikes mercilessly removed the pro player's health. The swordswoman smirked, threatening Tegan with an inglorious death. It was then, at the limit of his abilities, that the hero repelled the attack. Thus, the pro player's final opponent was defeated. The game immersion capsule opened. From there, Tegan appeared quite exhausted. Immediately, the crowd began chanting his name. Even Nate joined in. For the first time, the pro player felt his importance. But most of all, he was pleased with the praise from the hero. For Nate, the match was going extremely well. From now on, don't be afraid of risk when betting on your team. But the league continued, and some of the teams still suffered a defeat. Some were taken by skill, others by cunning. Only Lim survived, but was injured. The elite newcomers managed to cover themselves with glory. The stakes were rising, and the chances of Nate's team winning were falling. The hero still saw the outcome as beneficial. After all, by winning, one could collect a huge amount of money. Worried, the director no longer demanded Nate's victory. Wishing for a draw, he noticed shaking on the hero's side. But it was not a manifestation of fear. Rather, it was a thirst for what was to come. Thanks to the director, Nate was able to escape the dream world. The protagonist tensed his body, preparing for the confrontation. For all the spectators, he was something incomprehensible. A newbie who was given a chance. The hero himself enjoyed the feeling of glory. The way the spotlight caressed his image. He quickly jumped into the capsule and entered the game. In a flash, he found his target. One of the elite newcomers looked at him suspiciously. Afterwards, first of all, I released the seeds into it. The grass around Nate began to bloom vigorously. His legs got stuck in that one. At the same time, the girl was preparing her magic. Then, the summoned lightning struck the hero. Sparks of electricity spread across his armor. The recoil system automatically came into action. A moment later, the lightning bolt returned to the girl. There was nothing she could do about it anymore. A terrible punishing magic engulfed her body. The swordswoman openly worried about the fate of one of her own. Before her eyes, the newcomer easily overcame the difficulty. Little did she know, Nate was enjoying the process. Moreover, the equipment contributed to this in every possible way. The next action he took was to finish off his opponent. Now we wait to see who will be nominated next. The portal worked and Lin came out into the arena. As she drew the bowstring, she did not know what the hero was preparing for her. Seeing how Maiden behaved, the pro player remembered himself. Next, the hero struck the ground with his fist. The resulting shockwave also affected the archer. Her aim was off, which Nate took advantage of. In the moment of confusion, he suddenly disappeared somewhere. But in reality, Nate did make a high jump. Now diving from a great height, having spotted him, the archer was about to shoot down the protagonist. Finally, the arrows were fired. In flight, Nate fought them off. The archer tensed with a bad feeling. Meanwhile, Tegan figured out Nate's trick. Using the heat from his boots, he guided himself in flight. Getting lower and lower, the protagonist fought off more and more arrows, until the distance between him and the archer was reduced to its limit. Seeing the threatening trend, the swordswoman warned Bin. But it was too late to change anything. With tremendous speed, Nate fell on her. An impenetrable pillar of fire rose in all directions. The director became nervous, not knowing what to expect, his fists clenched with excitement. In the end, heart-rendingly congratulating Madanvan. After all, in the current fight, he rose cheerfully from the ground. The presenter similarly shared the director's emotions. The story took a step back, moving forward a couple of hours before the tournament. Then, with interest, the hero studied the dossiers of all three newcomers. The hero demanded no less than $10,000 as his condition for defeating them. The conditions of victory, as well as the rewards, shocked the director quite a bit. And yet he thought about it. Finally, after clearing his throat, he hinted at some kind of guarantees from Nate. Afraid to speak out, the director did not really believe that the hero was a newcomer. The hero laughed without revealing the truth. With certain reservations, the director was willing to make a deal with Nate. Now, in the present, Nate did not disappoint that one's expectations. Flaunting the beauty of a phoenix, the hero rose from the fire and ashes. The next one to appear in the arena was Gin. By threatening, he intended to disgrace Nate. Moreover, being confident that the enemy's health was calculated as no more than 1 HP. Having climbed onto the ledge of the rock, he playfully jumped off it. Nate watched Gin's flight closely. At the right time, preparing one of his lava legs. It goes without saying that this blow hit Gin. He lost his balance and was knocked down. A second later, it began to squeal from the unbearable heat from the spilling lava. With all his might, Gim tried to get out of this trap and at least get some treatment. A moment later, he was furiously finished off by the protagonist. The defeat of another participant no longer surprised anyone. Meanwhile, Nate loudly demanded another victim. Immediately after this, a portal opened and a swordswoman appeared. Her commanding gaze fell on the hero. Out loud, Nate even laughed at you, threatening to deal with you like he did with the other sisters. The swordswoman smiled, ready to make Nate answer for everything. After which, she performed a jumping jump. Having divided the sword, she was ready for this duel. Nate's fist was already moving to intercept it. A swing was made, but the charged attack missed its target. The hero expected something like this. Having jumped over the protagonist, the swordswoman now made her move. Looking at Nate's movements, she also noted that he was quite good. Next, activating your ult. The director became nervous, urging the hero to immediately dodge. 2 points of magical strikes moved relentlessly towards Nate's armor. The hero stepped to the side, easily saving himself. The swordswoman was unpleasantly surprised by Madanvan's ability to so easily evade attacks. To other witnesses, from the outside, Nate's movements truly looked inconceivable. The protagonist himself simply used the knowledge of the past, especially considering the swordswoman's attack angles. The thing was that with a short time interval, instead of a double blow, the swordswoman delivered 2 in turn, but extremely quickly. Simply by hitting the right timing, Nate easily dodged her attacks. However, to an outside observer, it looked as if all the damage was happening to Nate. But he remained alive. Even though she didn't know the reason for Nate's vitality, the swordswoman was extremely unhappy with this fact. This meant that the girl had very few hidden trump cards up her sleeve. After which, the swordswoman went on the attack again. As before, Nate did everything he could to avoid getting hit. But on the 10th try, it seemed that one of the blows was about to hit the target. Tegan was worried about Nate's fate, urging him to be careful. After all, by changing her tactics, behind the usual distracting blows, the swordswoman hid her true, fatal one. And it was right now that she pulled off this trick. Everything was done perfectly, as her sword was ultimately caught in the claws of the hero's glove. The protagonist boasted that he remembered all the swordswoman's movements exactly. Then, twisting her arm, Nate threw the sword aside. At that moment, in his thoughts, he already saw himself as the triumphant champion of the league, who single-handedly defeated even the famous sisters. Now, for the amusement of the public, Nate was going to show himself off in all his glory. After which, he kicked the swordswoman with his fiery shoes. Immediately, with his second foot, he struck the ground, causing a destructive wave. Somewhere in the midst of this horror, the swordswoman met her inglorious end. In the glow of fire, smoke, and ash, only Nate was now visible. He even started to call the next one, but remembered that he had defeated absolutely everyone. Having received the system's reward for his winning streak, Nate would leave the game. The capsule opened, returning the hero to the real world. But as soon as the sounds of the world reached his ears, Nate was stunned by it. Roaring in ecstasy, the entire audience greeted him. Without hiding his joy, the director almost lifted Nate into his arms. Even though it was under the guise of Madanvan, Nate managed to make himself famous for the first time. The crowd chanted his name loudly and without stopping. and all this sweet glory was extremely to Nate's liking. Gradually, the action moved to another part of the city. On the upper floors of the already familiar building, they closely followed Mandavan's adventures. The door opened and Brother Udahi appeared, announcing the collection of money. However, the redhead did not react to this visit in any way. Udahi was completely mesmerized by Mandavan's performance. In the competition, Tegan showed himself to be excellent. Lim didn't fall into the mud, even though he was eliminated from the competition. And only thanks to Mandavan's audacity, the First National League finally won the competition. Nate was the big winner, as in addition to fame, he also made money on the bets. Later, after collecting his winnings, Nate was driving his sports car again. The road led him to the city streets. Mostly, in the evenings, the protagonist spent his time on raids, but not this time. After all, now Nate was aiming for business, wanting to start his journey with a capsule hotel. The hero felt how money gave him power over the world, opening absolutely any doors. However, the hero's behavior was so absurd that it attracted the attention of others. A little out of character, he found it strange that there were so many people on the streets on a Friday evening. Somewhere, drunk men were beating each other's faces. The lovers cooed as they greeted the serene twilight. Synthwave music was playing here and there in the nightclubs. Such nonsense no longer interested Nate. After all, in his soul, he still remained a supporter of a quiet room and the hum of a computer in it. The hero did not regret anything, knowing the value of himself and his desires. After all, unlike others, Nate's main goal in life now was to strive for more. From such great thoughts, the hero suddenly came out. An interesting female figure appeared in front of him. Taking a closer look, Nate quickly recognized the beauty Udahi. Nate quickly hid behind the corner and began to follow her. Now remembering that about an hour ago, the redhead wrote a letter to Mandavan's account. Taking his phone out of his pocket, the hero decided to study it. In a long message, the girl admitted that she was passionately interested in Mandavan in every sense of the word. The businesslike nature of Udahi intrigued Nate. At that very second, one thought matured in his head. Udahi herself had just left a bar where she had gotten pretty drunk on cheap booze. Now, not really controlling herself, she didn't even really understand what she was doing on the street. After all, the girl was not a fan of drinking and partying, preferring an alternative in the form of video games. Sighing, she admitted that right now she'd rather be clearing dungeons in an MMO again. Just then, suddenly a notification came on her phone. Dejectedly, she took her phone out of her bag. Finding the new message, the redhead felt an electric shock run through her entire body. After all, there, in the correspondence, Mandavan gave his consent to the liquidation of a certain player. Meanwhile, this interesting night continued. As quickly as possible, Udahi returned to her car. Quickly jumping into it, she casually threw off her outerwear. Now, secretly from prying eyes, pondering the quick response from Mandavan. But the chance was so tempting that the redhead simply couldn't help but take advantage of it. Having decided to arrange a personal meeting, Udahi was not very flattered when Mandavan suggested doing the same on the street. The girl made a displeased face when Mandavan described what was very close to her. Then, she became completely furious when the next message said that she was behind that one. A second later, in the rearview mirror, she actually saw a figure. The tall man was indeed standing behind Udahi's car. The appearance and the anticipation of it seriously scared the redhead. And yet, a little later, having pulled herself together, she led him into the salon. Uncomfortably, Udahi tried to start a casual conversation with Nate. Oddly enough, the hero agreed with her words. Then their conversation touched on the peculiarities of Mandavan's life, and the fact that he doesn't have his own car. Having decided to get away from the annoying conversations, the hero called Udahi clients, and not just a girl. And yet, the redhead was a little worried about the masked man's quick agreement to kill. In a detached tone, Mandavan explained that he was personally familiar with Udahi's problem. Playing his role, recognizing himself as a very strong player. Grinding her teeth, the girl forced herself to agree with these conclusions. Continuing to fool Udahi, Mandavan admitted that he had already been looking for a reason to fight Nate. The redhead was glad to hear this, promising to arrange everything. The hero guessed that in addition to revenge, Udahi was obviously planning to remove the content. Additionally, Udahi swore that she would provide Mandavan with all the assistance her guild could provide. Looking at her, Nate found the girl so self-confident in her abilities for the first time. However, the redhead understood perfectly well that in the eyes of others, she looked very suspicious. At the same time, it was clear that Udahi's hatred for Nate was extreme. Just the thought of it drove the red-haired beast crazy. Almost hysterically, Udahi admitted that she had to get rid of Nate. The hero found the girl's words, and her attitude in general, to be quite unfair. Nate did kill her many times, but he did not do it out of any personal grudge. In the end, they both sat silently, lost in their own thoughts. A minute later, Udahi came to her senses and apologized. The girl admitted that no matter how hard she tried, she could not personally defeat Nate. After some time, Mandavan finally raised the issue of payment for his services. It would have been true that the redhead thanked the hero without hearing it, because for the first time she was able to speak out. After waiting a couple more seconds, Yutaka's lips trembled. Unexpectedly, she began to ask Mandavan to kill Nate on behalf of that guild. In order to try to win Mandavan over to her side, the girl even sat closer. Staring at him, in her mind, Udahi already saw how this deal had solved a whole bunch of her problems. With all sorts of cunning feminine hints, she tried to win him over to her side. From a soft voice to accidental touches. Moreover, he wouldn't mind having a snack together. But then, from Mandavan's direction, a disapproving growl was heard. The food offered by Udahi was not particularly pleasing, containing a lot of fats and other harmful substances. Moreover, Nate did not feel any attraction to the current Udahi. Moreover, the hero was a fan of older, experienced, and powerful women. The current Udahi was only a pale shadow of her majestic self in the future. But then the redhead saw that Mandavan had climbed where he shouldn't have. She screamed and asked him not to touch anything in the car. Now, holding the trash in his hands, Nate remembered something. After all, in the past, once, Nate had already been in this very same place. Then, being in love with the redhead, the hero tried in every possible way to please her, only now realizing how naive a fool he was. And yet, our protagonist did not leave trash in the car. Mandavan's behavior frightened Udahi. Even though the conversation didn't go well, the redhead's manners somehow excited her. Walking along the night streets, Nate recalled that in terms of garbage collection, he was Udahi's first. His sad thoughts seemed to influence the weather and caused rain. At the same time, the girl tried to sort out her emotions. For some reason, her heart was beating wildly. Much later, after the foreplay, Nate and Mandavan met. Smiling, the hero teased the masked man. Mandavan himself did not hide the fact that he had come to kill Nate. Afterwards, a small conversation started between them, at the end of which, Mandavan called for a showdown to find out who was stronger. After speaking, in his signature tactic, Mandavan stamped his foot. Even in this situation, Nate tried to be funny. Mandavan described all his actions, including the murder of players, as a requirement of the contract. After which, he waved his claws. Nate dodged and counterattacked. Flinging himself from the blade, he tried to increase the distance between himself and the masked man, and yet recognizing Mandavan as a worthy opponent. In any case, without promising him victory over himself. Having charged his skills, Nate went on the attack. A lot of people were now watching this battle and the miserable conversations that took place there. Those watching had no idea where exactly the skirmish was taking place. Some wanted to help one of the sides, while others simply enjoyed the spectacle itself. After all, the battle itself was truly incredible. Both sides there gave it their all. In his signature style, Mandavan kept setting fire to everything around him. He used his claws to apply debuffs, at some point seriously injuring Nate. His heavy cry was heard by absolutely all viewers of the broadcast, following which, the broadcast strangely stopped. A minute later, a video from Nate himself appeared on the internet. There, the protagonist admitted that he lost the fight to the weirdo. Meanwhile, Nate promised to return and take revenge for everything. At the end, he demonstratively clenched his hand into a fist. Jumping up from her chair, Udahi solemnly marked this event. For the first time in a long time, Udahi could now sleep peacefully again. But Nate's video didn't end right away, as there followed an afterword with words about a rematch. The hero invited all his spectators and other onlookers to attend this spectacle. This epilogue caused the chats to explode. The red-haired beast in particular was furious, not expecting such a turn of events. Now, for the sake of a way to once again disgrace Nate, and to become famous herself, she is ready to hire Mandavan again. Udahi's brother tried to protect him from such thoughtless spending, but it was too late, because the girl had already sent the money, and at the same time received gratitude from Mandavan. The brother didn't understand Udahi's obsession, and besides, Nate had been avenged. His words brought the girl back to her senses a little. Be that as it may, a strange feeling tormented the redhead. Elsewhere, Tegan was also watching this battle. The thought crept into his head that Mandavan and the naked pervert were one and the same person. Suddenly, history took a step back, rewinding 6 months. Nate, as usual, was fighting with someone. He didn't want to waste time, so he tried to ignore the mobs. Since the protagonist's main goal was someone behind those. After this was said, the monsters looked at Nate strangely. Suddenly, the illusionary magic took effect. Opposite the hero, 3 copies of Nate appeared at once. The protagonist rejoiced, even though he had heard that if he saw 3 copies of himself at once, there would be no chance of success. Now, I want to test this rumor for strength. The fight with myself has begun. Very soon, the first double received a razor thrust into his chest. Nate didn't stop, continuing to attack relentlessly. Their battle tactics were changed by their copies. The hero mocked the copies, who barely matched the real Nate in their capabilities, because the copy monsters simply couldn't think. As a result, Nate managed to catch them off guard. The hero's next attack on the enemies resulted in a stunning explosion. Looking at the glow, Nate didn't particularly like the fact that he had managed to defeat his copies in literally 1 try. Meanwhile, the fire started by the hero gradually died down. Because of that, a bluish, lanky creature was shown. This is exactly what the protagonist was waiting for. It was the Kaiser himself, the greatest of doubles. Having approached a certain distance, Kaiser's body began to pulsate. It changed in size, its fingers bent and its bones broke. Swiftly, the familiar outlines of armor appeared on it. The monster's figure hunched over, becoming much smaller than its original form. Thorns appeared, the body was encased in armor. Now, standing opposite Nate was a practically fully formed Madanvan. At the end of the transformation process, the double slowly raised his head towards the hero. Nate himself also dressed in the Madanvan set. Next, he reached for his mask, taking that one off and wanting to find out who was really more beautiful. Imitating Nate's actions, Kaiser also reached for his mask. However, breaking it was not so easy. The sticky substance held, and when it was torn off, it spilled out as blood. Then, with all his strength, Kaiser threw off the mask. No longer a part of its owner, it dissolved before our eyes. At the sight of this, Nate had a crazy smile. For some reason, he rushed towards the mask. It was now, taking advantage of the opportunity, that Kaiser took a swing. The hero easily dodged the initial attack. However, the double was not so simple either. Following the blow, he jumped on the spot. Nate had no idea that the double would use a deliberate fall to cause an earthquake. Not stopping there, Kaiser also used arm claws. Digging up the very ground with them, he threw stones at the hero. Nate tensed up considerably, but didn't let the shards touch him. He was absolutely delighted to see the power he possessed, after which he used the summoning ring. A snake appeared that Nate did not want to use, but had no other choice. Having quickly mounted him, the protagonist began to flee. After all, with the item received from the Kaiser, the hero was going to make a certain Mandanvan debut, and yet, promising to one day return to the double. Once Nate had moved far enough away, the image of Kaiser began to crumble. Luck was on Nate's side, so the mask of the rogue, which gave the wearer special characteristics, was now in his possession. Moreover, through a difficult search, the hero managed to discover a secret double boss. That's exactly how the story plan sounded in Nate's head at one point. Currently visiting the evil twin again? However, he did not respond to Nate's greeting. So, taking advantage of the opportunity, Nate performed some voice manipulation through the system settings. Once finished, he began recording his conversation with Madanvan. Taking advantage of the change in his voice, Nate answered himself. Without breaking character, Nate allegedly provoked Madanvan into another fight. At some point, the double began to move. With a long monologue, Nate began to play out the scene for the audience. As a devoted fan of Madanvan, Udahi was the first one to watch the broadcast. More and more people joined in this spectacle. Some of them even cried. The dialogue between Madanvan and Nate was so touching. When the empty talk ended, Nate called on Madanvan to defend himself. This did not frighten Madanvan, because he had never lost before. He raised his claws and urged Nate to attack. Finally, the fight began, and Madanvan was the first to use his skills. The hero chuckled at his opponent's serious attitude. It was then, at the right moment, that Nate activated the summoning ring. The whirlwind raised by Madanvan was about to hit Nate. The sight of the fight took the spectator's breath away. However, the hero was not harmed, because the summoned snake took all the damage from the skill on itself. Jumping over him, with a razor at the ready, Nate flew towards Madanvan. The mask's owner counterattacked furiously with his claws. A second later, the two forces collided. At the moment that arose, Nate had the audacity to inquire about the secret of Madanvan's increased powers. At the same time, he activates his own skill. Seizing the moment, the hero's body hardened. The fight between these two mastodons was truly great. The surrounding location was literally bursting at the seams. Trees, mountains, even the earth itself, everything was shattered into pieces. But Madanvan was restless. He attacked relentlessly, not giving Nate a chance to catch his breath. However, over time, his attacks became less and less fast. Madanvan's strength was running out, but he did not pretend that his weakness had been exposed. A little worried about the performance that had just been played out, Nate even whispered to Madanvan what exactly needed to be done next. Having done so, Madanvan carried out his stomp. The resulting shockwave sent Nate flying. The spectators were impressed by the progress of the battle. This had been going on for about an hour, and none of the opponents had inflicted any significant damage on the other. It was then that Nate extended his hand towards Madanvan. Squeezing his fingers, he activated the bloodthirst skill. Blood began to actively ooze through Mandavan's armor. The owner of the mask could not move instead of a voice. An indistinct muttering now came from his lips. The hero laughed at this, because he had found his enemy's weakness after all. Gripping the razor tighter in his hands, Nate was about to end Mandavan's suffering. This hint from the hero was recognized by Mandavan. Perhaps with the last of his strength, he again thrust his claws into the ground. Immediately, another explosion followed in the area of impact. The space was plowed again. Nate watched as Mandavan rose, forcing the emotion of fear out of himself. The next moment, he was again preparing to stamp his foot. However, Mandavan hesitated to take this action. Nate scoffed, knowing that his opponent had already spent all his strength. As expected, under the weight of its own blows, the ground beneath Mandavan cracked. Steadily, it began to fall into the lava flows below it. While immersing himself in those, he promised that he would definitely return. Silently, the hero watched as his enemy melted in the magma. This event came as a shock to other spectators. Everyone was stunned, not even knowing what to think. After all, besides the battle, they were especially touched by the true voice of Madanvan himself. Even Nate himself didn't expect this from his clone. Now, simply looking at the beautiful death of the enemy, that's exactly how the current broadcast ended with Nate's victory. Finally, he informed his fans that from now on, the score of victories and defeats was evened out. At home, Udahi took Madanvan's defeat as a personal tragedy. From now on, her hatred for Nate became worse than before. The brother's voice was heard, trying to calm the redhead down. Helping her come to her senses, her brother even brought her some napkins. After blowing his nose and crying a lot, the old emotions left Udahi. Her voice hardened, proclaiming the unacceptability of what had happened. The brother recoiled at the sight of Udahi's blatant determination. After all, it was now that the girl proclaimed herself and her guild to be the Madanvan fan club. It quickly dawned on Gallatin that the Redheads guild was mostly made up of girls. This means that the girls there perceived their leader's preferences as their own. And yet, he did not understand at all why all this was necessary. Clenching her fists, Udahi swore that she would avenge Madanvan. Almost burning with emotion, she said over and over again that she would finish off Nate. At the same time, the hero celebrated the successful completion of the operation. For the show that was put on, money from sponsors flowed like a river into the hero's accounts. Additionally, right now, I am uploading a video of the raid on the King of Darkness to my channel. Anticipating thousands of views, Nate rubbed his hands eagerly. Moreover, the hero's plan to exalt one character and bring down another was unfolding before our eyes. And Nate was always in control of the situation. After all, both characters were Nate himself. Suddenly, he remembered his phone. Not long ago, due to the abundance of friend requests, the protagonist turned it off. Now, including that one, Nate was faced with an avalanche of notifications. Taking the phone in his hands, the hero did not really understand how to solve such a problem. Reading through notifications, amidst friend requests and other spam, I find something interesting. Several letters were sent to Nate from former classmates who were now looking for a meeting with him. The hero was rather disgusted by their advances, because at school, Nate was an outcast. Until I finally came across an invitation for a class reunion. Instantly, moments from his school life came flooding back to Nate's mind. One day, in class, they required those whose families were incomplete to fill out a form. Of course, it was about Nate, but even now, no one was eager to approach him. There was a long dispute over who would give Nate the papers, until a girl's voice was heard giving consent. The classmate with glasses was not averse to handing the hero the papers, and besides, she herself had to sign them. Hearing this, the headman agreed to the proposal. Slowly, the bespectacled girl walked towards Nate, who was sleeping on the desk. In a calm voice, she called him. When the hero looked up, she was handing over the document. Suddenly, with a scream and a heavy sigh, Nate woke up from the nightmare. Wearing a business suit, he was inside his car. Now, having found himself personally on the side of the movie heroes, Nate understood why those parts took revenge on their classmates. And yet, among the horde of freaks at the upcoming event, Nate only remembered that same girl with glasses. Hoping to meet her, he would have something to say to her face. Around the same time, a fierce confrontation was taking place inside the game. There, for the first time, Tegan hunted monsters on higher difficulty levels. Even this event had some spectators. Besides the fighting technique, the spectators were especially impressed by the pro player's strength. But then someone called out to the onlookers. Quan considered passion for games and all that other stuff unworthy of an adult. Quan tried to teach his friends the ways of reason, while they spent their time improving their stats in games. Soon, there was a knock on the door of the room where everyone was. A little while later, Nate came inside. Almost everyone present stared at him. Those present immediately recognized Nate, because he was popular. Only Quan didn't understand why there was so much attention on Nate. A little later, the discussions around the hero only grew. Among those present, the girls in particular were particularly flattering towards Nate. Chuckling uncomfortably, the protagonist concluded that he was glad to see everyone. The girls continued to fawn, hinting at how much Nate had matured. At some point, Quan called out to the hero. With just one glance, Nate recognized him. Memories of one summer at school came flooding back to his mind. Back then, poor Nate was getting it pretty bad. Like the others, Quan didn't want to sit with a pauper. Every now and then, he sets conditions for Nate to necessarily level up characters in the MMO, instead of himself. In those days, the hero could only endure and come to terms with his fate. Already in the present, talking to Quan, the hero admitted that he was playing video games again. Quan laughed at Nate's hobbies, advising him to at least take on a part-time job. The implication is that in this way, even in old age, the protagonist will not be able to save money. Boasting, Quan named the figure of 20,000 that they wanted on his account. This absurd conversation was interrupted by one of the girls. After all, right now Nate's award ceremony was on television. Everyone fell silent, listening to the presenter's words. When the speech touched on the awards being given out, Quan choked on his own drink. Under the spotlight, Nate thanked the host. In the middle of the screen, on the bottom line, A caption kept running about the protagonist's incredible annual income as a streamer. Nate's voice came over, admitting that saving money in the account was indeed a pleasant experience. Subsequently, all the attention of his former classmates was again focused on Nate. Left alone, Quan could only continue frying the meat. Now, the girls were clinging to the protagonist, showing off their business ideas, or trying to get into his pants. The hero laughed it off and avoided conversations, although he admitted that the event had tired him out. Being an old man in the shell of a young man, Nate ultimately decided to leave the meeting. Turning his body, suddenly his gaze froze. In the midst of a crowd of faces, seeing one, but special image. It was Asel. Nate was absolutely sure of it. However, the girl seemed to be completely oblivious to Nate, and was already leaving the event. Having quickly apologized to everyone, the hero also decided to leave the meeting. Meanwhile, Asel managed to move a couple of meters away from the establishment. Just a little more, and she would have disappeared into the middle of the city's night streets. But suddenly her steps began to fade away. Someone called Asel by name. She turned around to see Nate standing out of breath next to her. The hero radiated joy that he finally managed to see her. With an uncertain voice, she nevertheless recognized Nate. Following which, there was a slightly awkward pause. The protagonist even began to shake, as he had no idea how to continue the conversation. Finally, he managed to squeeze out an offer to go somewhere. Quite quickly, they found a suitable place. While sipping the drink, the hero began a conversation. So they both touched on the fact of Nate's fame. Subsequently, the topic moved on to Asel herself. The girl admitted that, having gone through many difficulties, she was now studying at university. After listening to all this, Nate looked down for a second or two. After which, he admitted that he wanted to thank Asel. After all, the girl was the only one who didn't shy away from communicating with the hero in class. Nate's hands began to shake at what he said. Asel herself had not seen anything unusual in what the hero had said. And yet, now she herself was apologizing to Nate. The hero was intrigued. Suddenly, Asel admitted that she came to the meeting just to meet Nate himself. But when the protagonist was engulfed in someone else's attention, the girl simply did not dare to approach him. Having said this, Asel hesitated. A couple of seconds later, in a more touching manner, turning to Nate again. Then, jumping up from her seat, she said that she had something to ask. Subsequently, he told the protagonist the story of his mother's serious illness. At the same time, she made it clear that she had no intention of asking Nate for a loan. Suddenly, the girl fell silent again. Nate said nothing, waiting to see how it would all end. Finally, Asel admitted that she dared to start streaming in order to earn money. Oddly enough, Nate became interested in Asel's words, now wanting to know more. As for the direction of the streams and the platform, the girl still avoided answering. And yet, Asel did not finish. Surprisingly, she interrupted her speech. At some point, taking off her glasses, she began to apologize altogether. Quickly wiping away her tears and saying goodbye, she hurried to leave the meeting. But Nate's tenacious hand stopped Asel, grabbing her. The hero said he was ready to help everyone, even to be a guest on Asel's stream. Nate made it clear that he knew what it was like to rise from the bottom. After Nate gave his consent, the night passed. In another part of the city, the protagonist's sports car is now parked. As expected, Nate came to Asel. While helping, he even took all kinds of equipment with him. Already at home, Asel's mother greeted Nate as her daughter's boyfriend. Asel justified herself to the contrary, and the sick woman left the sick people to their own devices. While setting up the equipment in Asel's room, Nate wanted to know about the girl's unusual choice of streaming category. Asel admitted that although she was smart, she didn't know how to create educational content. After a couple of minutes, the hero finished installing the light. Asel was beaming with happiness, because the prepared studio was truly impressive. Now, the girl's room really did resemble a place for professional streaming. Later, Asel began to tell how exactly she conducted her streams. Then she admitted that in the best-case scenario, she had about 15 spectators. Nate didn't blame Asel. He just knew that there was a lot of work ahead. For the first time, for someone, the protagonist himself became a support. However, it was impossible to delay any longer, so Nate announced the start of the broadcast right now. At the same time, something was happening inside the Tower of Braves. Now, there, the shooter Drake fought with the monsters. After a long battle, the terrible monster was finally defeated. Drake admitted to himself that after the 30th floor, the difficulty increased many times over. Having the opportunity, he caught his breath. After all, secretly from everyone, Drake intended to beat Nate's record for the number of floors completed in the tower. Right now, the shooter received a notification from the system. Drake read the words there in surprise. After all, the talk was about eliminating Nate. This was the second time the shooter had encountered the announcement of a reward for the hero's head. In the present, Asel's broadcast has started. While talking about creams, she walked around a prepared human model. Nate played his part humbly, even though he expected something completely different. Next, the girl's brush began to gently move over Nate's body. While the hero was getting his makeup applied, Nate himself was quite embarrassed by what was happening. The protagonist only hoped that Asel's broadcast wouldn't be visited by fans of male friendship. A couple of minutes ago, It came as a shock to him that it was Nate who would be acting as a makeup model. The broadcast's viewers themselves were making fun of Nate in every possible way. Strangely enough, only Asel didn't notice the trash that was going on in the chat. The girl was completely absorbed in the process, now moving on to the area of the eyes and ears. At some point, she stopped her actions. The hero became interested in what had caused the stop. Instantly, Asel tore the hoop off Nate's head, after which the girl was delighted. After all, with his hair down, the protagonist was much more handsome. All viewers agreed with this event, gradually beginning to recognize the famous streamer's model, Dead Water. In response to Asel's actions, the hero also reached for the girl's bangs. Now he wanted to show and demonstrate to everyone else how good she was. Thanks to Nate's efforts, Asel acquired a charmingly sweet image. The sight of her beauty even drove the hero into a stupor. Asel was embarrassed, but there was nothing she could do about it. With this simple event, Nate managed to motivate viewers to actively fork out donations. It was right now, through the screen, that Asel's mother intervened in the streaming process itself. The woman wanted to know what exactly the young people were doing so violently. Nate and Asel froze, not even knowing how to explain everything. A few moments later, the girl rushed to her mother to escort her out of her room. About 3 days have passed since the beauty broadcast. In messages and calls, Asel thanked Nate in every way for her initial popularity. Moreover, thanks to the money she earned, Asel was able to send her mother for treatment. Now, for the future, inviting Nate to attend a family dinner. Nate wasn't worried about Asel, seeing perfectly well that she was capable. Having settled other people's problems, the hero now has to return to his own life. There, he was going to find information about people who had already managed to kill the hero a couple of times. A strange voice pulled Nate out of his thoughts. There was a girl standing nearby who called him the expert. The hero was not particularly pleased with this meeting, since he became overly recognizable. Sighing, Nate decided to introduce himself. But before he could even finish speaking, he felt the girl's mood change. Holding the box in her hands, she suddenly swung it. Before he could take any action, the box flew into Nate, spraying aerosol on impact. The smells of various perfumes hit the hero's nose. Inevitably, the process of changing the character's appearance began. A few seconds later, Nate discovered that he had gone completely bald. The girl herself started to run away, making it clear at the end that she was taking revenge for Madanvan. The protagonist, although enraged, had no intention of harming the girl. One way or another, the hero's plans were thwarted, because in this image, he would have attracted too much attention. Thoughts of anger and revenge suddenly left Nate. After all, in front of that completely bald man stood Drake. A moment later, they both started laughing at each other's ridiculous appearance. As it turned out, the poor shooter, as Nate's ally, was also caught in a vile female attack. In any case, at the present time, the hero was concerned with completely different things. In the real world, Nate tried to find at least some clues about who was hunting the hero. The only clue found was a newly formed group of newbie players. One day, the search bore fruit, and Nate learned a little more about the mysterious guild. Besides the strange name, the guild even had its own website, which, as it turned out, was dedicated to a close connection with Madanvan. Nate shared these discoveries with Drake. Nate was not happy that, in the form of a double, he had created his own worst enemy. However, Nate was not going to turn a blind eye to these things, and already had some kind of plan. Plus, for something interesting, I'm inviting Drake along. A little later, in another place, angry voices thundered. Many players wanted the expert dead. With each passing minute, their numbers only grew. All of them demanded the death of the pink bald man. At this moment, Nate understood exactly how the assassination attempt on him was supposed to take place. But even in such a difficult situation, the hero had some kind of idea. As quickly as possible, he summoned the faithful serpent. Following this, something began to move across the roofs of the city buildings. At some point, they jumped right into the crowd of players. Panic immediately broke out among them. With lightning-fast movements, something began to cut a passage for itself. Fountains of blood spurted in all directions. Amidst the raining horror, the survivors identified the expert. In just a few moments, Nate managed to deal with a ton of opponents at once. He himself looked tense, and his eyes blazed with anger. Reinforcements arrived, and now they wanted to deal with the hero. The bravest of the players hastened to join the battle. With just one swing, the hero struck down those. The most brutal blows cut the enemies to pieces. Amidst the confusion and bloody haze, Nate pushed forward. Many of those present considered the protagonist's actions to be truly insane. Having broken through the first barrier, the protagonist rushed forward. With his sharp razor, he scared away random players. But even here, bumping into a fanatic girl. Having identified him, she immediately launched a signal flare into the sky. With a beautiful glow, it exploded over the city. Laughing, the girl promised the protagonist a death that would be impossible to avoid. Her self-confidence knew no bounds. Suddenly, she became distracted. Indeed, absolutely similar outbreaks began to occur throughout the entire city. The girl was completely confused. It was now that Nate made his move. He got rid of her as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, all over the city, Observers kept recording Nate's appearance. His attacks began to take on an avalanche-like character. There were screams everywhere and the streets were stained with blood. Everyone who encountered the hero did not survive. Finally, to the widespread alarm, Udahi appeared. At some point, noticing Nate, she threw an axe in his direction. The weapon hit its target with extreme success. However, the body of the dead player immediately began to change. The redhead understood that she had defeated not Nate himself, but simply a monster double. Right now, Udahi reported how one post after another was destroyed under the pressure of the protagonist. Gallatin reported that the guild's strength was weakening and losses were growing. Gritting her teeth in rage, Udahi urged her strength to gather. After which, command the troops to split into two groups. Based on the direction of the greatest losses, she determined that Nate was clearly moving north. Meanwhile, Nate and Drake continued to break through. But before getting involved in this whole adventure, the hero first visited the Forest of Doubles, where he caught many monsters. By means of his snake, he imprisons monsters in a kind of prison. That's exactly how the protagonist unleashed a ton of his copies on the city. At this point, the shooter decided to find out something. The hero looked at him with interest. Without slowing down, Drake wanted to know why the protagonist was so eager to venture into unknown areas. Nate smiled and described his route only as a stop to get somewhere bigger. The shooter didn't really like this answer. Afterwards, his eyes even flinched. Nate admitted that he was going to change the game itself, and it was precisely towards such accomplishments that the hero set his course. After all that had been said, the characters stood opposite each other. Another minute, and now they are both laughing. Now, the hero only had to figure out whether he would have a partner. The shooter nodded eagerly to Nate. Everything was decided and both of them moved on. Udahi followed in their footsteps restlessly. An hour later, the former gaming continent was left behind. In front of the players lay an endless wasteland of whiteness. Harsh climate, dangerous mountains, terrifying high-level monsters were also waiting for those. Knowing the battle tactics, Nate advised Drake on how exactly to attack. The shooter understood the plan of action very quickly. After the victory, Nate gave Drake the following orders. Having smeared themselves with the liquid flowing out of the monster, they moved on. The endless snowstorm gradually drove Drake crazy. The hero asked not to worry, because he knew when the storm would end. Once again, Nate's omniscience frightened the shooter. Then the hero explained that it was all about the number of snowflakes. The blizzard gradually died down, and the characters were searching for the monster. But Nate feared meeting someone even more frightening. For the first time, Drake saw the hero afraid of someone. However, he himself was afraid of meeting something like this. Unable to bear it any longer, I decided to find out if it was the boss. Nate did not respond, stating that the group had been spotted. The shooter tensed up and began to look around the area. From the endless whiteness of the snow, a silhouette began to emerge. Also seeing the silhouette, Nate called for escape. The next moment, the silhouette changed and increased speed. The creepy undead scurried towards the players, its many legs scurrying. No one had time to do anything, as she was already with Drake. The shooter screamed in horror. Purely mechanically, he pulled out one of his daggers. He performed a backward somersault and attacked the undead. The damage was done, but the monster stubbornly grabbed hold of his leg. A couple of seconds and the freezing magic began to bind the foot. Drake felt himself rapidly becoming cold. There was nothing else to do, so the shooter pulled out a crossbow. But he didn't have time to pull the trigger. The undead crawled up to the icy body in full growth. Her mouth opened to bite, but Nate intervened in time. After which, the hero lightly pushed Drake. The touch helped lift the chilling curse. Then, without having time to react, the undead now pressed themselves against Nate himself. The shooter made his move to save his comrade. The crossbow bolts he fired drove away the undead. The protagonist was rescued from the ice trap. Now Nate thanked his friend for saving him. Having a window of opportunity to act, both continued on their way. The protagonist explained that it was precisely because of the undead, and did not dare to go alone. During the conversation, a certain plan crept into Nate's mind. For the first time, I thought about defeating the undead, rather than running away. He began to imagine how far away Udahi's group was now. At the same time, in the midst of the snow, a fierce massacre was taking place. Blood flowed like a river. Udahi's group encountered such powerful mobs for the first time. Suddenly, one of the hikers saw a penguin. He was so cute that the girl leaned over him. But as soon as her hand reached out to stroke it, everything turned into a tragedy. The pointy-headed penguin pierced the poor thing right through. The redhead arrived to deal with that as quickly as possible. 100 steps closer, she swung her axe. However, the penguin was agile, so the blow went wide. Now it was the penguin's turn to act. In defense, Udahi assumed a defensive stance. Suddenly, a familiar voice called out to her. The redhead looked closely at the silhouette high on the snowdrift. Another moment and she recognized Nate in it. Filled with rage, she simply pushed the penguin away. She snatched up an axe and chopped the creature down in mid-flight. After which, she threw it at the hero's silhouette. In response, Nate's laughter was heard. Udahi, her eyes wide open, began to wait. As it turned out, she got rid of Nate's ice. The redhead didn't understand anything, because she hit him with a direct shot. Then, in the middle of the snow, a terrible laughter and howling was heard. The participants in the hike also heard all this and felt fear. Following them, the undead began to make their way towards them. One by one, the participants of the expedition were cursed. No matter how hard they tried, it was impossible to escape from the ice trap. Having assessed the situation as quickly as possible, Udahi had already seen certain countermeasures. The main thing was to hold out until sunrise. Time passed and almost the entire Udahi group froze. But even in this situation, she was not going to give up. Clutching the axe even tighter, she swore revenge. Meanwhile, somewhere far away, laughter rang out. Laughing, Nate was glad that he had gotten rid of the annoying monster. Here he explains that Udahi and the undead will still be useful. He even challenged Drake to guess what the plan was. A little later, the action moved to a frozen village. The local inhabitants remained forever in the ice. And while Drake was frightened by their images, Nate rummaged through the chests. However, the loot here did not make the protagonist very happy. Apart from potions and some food, there were no particularly valuable things here. The team then descended into the ice crevasse. At the bottom, Drake was kicking the ice for some reason. Having cleared it a little, he realized that the entire area had previously been a sea. Just in case, Nate reminded the shooter not to try to destroy the floor. For the sake of demonstration, throwing a bag at a distance. Having splashed onto the icy edge, blood began to flow out of the bag. Something in the ocean under the ice began to move. This is exactly what the hero was waiting for. The next moment, the ice cracked and broke through. Huge fins burst out. The ice shark's mouth followed them. The shooter was impressed by this appearance. The shark itself intended to attack the players. Drake, who was always happy to fight, also prepared himself. Both forces were about to intersect. Having the moment, the shooter scattered traps. Next, snatching and aiming the crossbow. But the shot didn't happen, because the shark broke through the ice underneath itself. Swimming under that, emerging after Drake. At the last moment, the shooter managed to escape the jaws. But no matter how hard Drake tried to catch the shark, it dived. Moreover, the floor itself was gradually deteriorating. Nate suggested leaving the shark and focusing on the quest. Moreover, the hero was aware of the monster's behavior pattern. Everything was based on patterns between dives. The only option for victory, seeing the closing of existing holes. Right now, someone was looking at the crevice from above. The protagonist knew that the one he had been waiting for had arrived. The next action was for the silhouette to jump into the crevice. Below, her menacing image was more clearly visible. It was none other than the warrior Udahi. Drake didn't expect to meet her. In fact, Nate himself seemed surprised. The other survivors of the expedition also descended. In fact, the hero was waiting to meet someone else. Nate looked closer and shuddered. An unusual bandage was visible on Udahi's eye. Thanks to the bandage, the redhead tracked down the protagonist. For the first time, Nate began to consider Udahi capable. Moreover, the hero's position was now quite difficult. All Nate could do was stall for time. So the first thing he did was call Udahi. However, the redhead didn't want to hear anything from him. But the hero continued his speech. With the words about the eye patch, he managed to embarrass Udahi. Just a meter away from Nate, she stopped. After all, Nate claimed that there was a secret hidden in the bandage. A couple of minutes passed, and Udahi's group descended into the crevice. All of them were preparing for the upcoming battle. Even the girl herself abruptly tore off her bandage. Seeing their determination, the hero tried to calm the crowd. Suddenly, Udahi moved towards it. Luckily, her path was blocked by an ice shark. In panic and horror, the redhead screamed. After all, never before had she seen such formidable monsters. The shark itself, in one flight, devoured a huge number of Udahi's fighters. Without losing control of herself, Udahi commanded. Immediately, various magic hit the shark. Even from the side, it was clear that the shark had suffered significant damage. Nate was scared, afraid that she might simply float away. So, the hero went into motion. As he walked, painfully biting his finger. Further, splashing his own blood. Luckily, the blood landed straight on the shark's face, now creating the magic of bloodthirst. At the same time, the Udahi magicians did not slow down either. The monster found itself under severe pressure.